Hey everyone, I'm the storyteller, and I'm here to guide you into a night of eerie tales and deep sleep. I know you use this video to unwind, so before you drift off, tap that like button and subscribe for more chilling stories. Also, drop a comment, where are you from, and what time are you watching? Now, get cozy, relax, and let the stories take over.
Last week I opened a folder of photos I had taken at an old cathedral downtown. I was about to select a few shots for a client who specializes in restoring ancient buildings. The images looked normal at first glance, but then I noticed something strange. In the corner of one picture there was a tall, thin figure in a black overcoat. The figure was turned away from the camera, and part of it was hidden by a thick shadow cast by a nearby column. I zoomed in, but I couldn't make out the person's face. I felt a slight chill in my chest. I assumed it was just some passerby who wandered into the frame without me noticing. I shrugged it off at first. I moved on to the next photo, a different angle of the same cathedral facade. I saw that figure again, this time standing near the entrance. Same height, same overcoat, same posture, always facing away. My neck felt tense as I looked closer. It was the exact same silhouette, but now the figure was in a different position. I didn't recall seeing anyone wearing a black overcoat that day. Plus, it had been hot outside, so it seemed odd. I examined the photo for a few more seconds and then checked a third shot. Same silhouette, standing near a column, still turned away from the camera. My stomach got tight. I felt a slight tremor in my fingers when I moved the mouse. I closed the photos and told myself I was just overthinking. The next morning I decided to do some color corrections. I wanted to finalize those photos because I had a deadline. I started with the first shot again. I was sure I remembered the figure's position. It was near the edge of the frame, partially hidden behind a column. But that morning the figure looked a few feet away from where it had been. It was still turned away, still wearing the black overcoat, but it had shifted closer to the center of the image. I felt my throat tighten and my breathing speed up. I thought maybe I'd mistaken the exact position, so I tried to compare it to a screenshot I had taken the day before. I didn't have that screenshot anymore though, because I had only taken a quick look, so I had nothing to compare. Still, I was convinced the figure had moved. I tried to ignore it, but I couldn't. I went through the rest of the images. In each one, the figure's position seemed different from the last time I saw it. In some shots, it was close to an archway. In others, it was near a stairwell, always turned away, always partially hidden in a shadow. My neck got stiff, and a light sweat started on my forehead. I felt a weird tingling in my lower back. Part of me wanted to shut down my computer and walk out, but I also felt a compulsion to keep looking. It was like I needed to confirm I wasn't losing my mind. Later that evening, I returned to my desk and decided to look at older files. I pulled up pictures from another shoot I had done a few weeks before, at a derelict monastery on the outskirts of town. It was a set of high-resolution shots meant for an architecture magazine. I clicked through them, one by one. They looked fine until I reached the last few. I saw that same tall figure in a black overcoat in the background of a shot taken inside a courtyard. It wasn't obvious at first, but there it was. Standing under a dark arch, shoulders hunched forward, face turned away. I felt a sharp stab of anxiety. My pulse raced. I checked the next photo in that series. The figure was closer to the left edge now, still facing away, half of its body hidden by a stone pillar. I tried to think logically. Maybe it's a glitch from the camera or some weird lighting issue. But it didn't make sense because the figure clearly had the shape of a person. The black overcoat had distinct folds. The silhouette was consistent. I stared at the screen until my eyes felt dry and strained. I didn't know what to do, so I saved everything, shut down my computer, and decided to go get some air. The next day, I was hired to take photographs of a rundown Romanesque church in a forgotten neighborhood. It was part of a personal project I was doing. I kept thinking about that figure in my shots, but I tried to focus on my work. The church was old and crumbling. There was moss on the walls and the smell of damp stone hung in the air. I walked around, snapping different angles. I always use a tripod for architecture photography because I want perfect alignment. That day, I kept looking over my shoulder, checking if anyone was around. I heard distant street noise but no footsteps. The place felt deserted. The entire time, my muscles were tense, and I had a slight headache from all the stress. When I went home, I felt uneasy about reviewing those new photos. I needed to, though, because I had to see if the figure appeared again. I set up my laptop on the dining room table. My palms felt sweaty. I opened the folder of raw files, scrolled through the thumbnails, and everything looked normal at first. Then I opened the images in full screen. On the third image, I saw a faint shape in the far right corner. I zoomed in. There it was again, tall, thin, black overcoat, back turned. I leaned in so close my nose almost touched the screen. My heart thumped in my chest. I clicked through a few more shots. The figure was in 4 of them, each time in a different spot. Sometimes near a column, sometimes by a broken bench, always turned away. The figure never faced me, and it was always partially hidden by shadows. It felt like a bad dream, but I was awake. I grabbed my phone and called an old friend who also works as a photographer. I told him something strange was happening with my photos and I needed his advice. He sounded skeptical but agreed to meet me at my office the next morning. I didn't sleep much that night. I lay in bed, my mind racing. I kept picturing that figure. I wondered if I'd see it in real life someday, not just in photos. Every time I heard a creak in my apartment, my muscles clenched. My mouth felt dry, and I kept wiping sweat from my forehead. The following day, my friend came over. I showed him the files. I pointed out the figure in each picture. He squinted at the screen. He said it looked like a person, but he wasn't sure why it would appear in all these different shoots. He asked if maybe it's a vagrant who follows me around. I said that made no sense because these locations were all over the city, and I never saw anyone in a heavy coat. Plus, the angles didn't match up. In one shot, the figure was in the corner. In another shot, it was near the center, like it had moved after the photo was taken. He checked the metadata of the files. Everything was normal. No signs of tampering. No overlays or weird exposure issues. He shrugged and said he had no explanation. He suggested I take a break or see a counselor in case I'm dealing with stress or anxiety. I felt a little offended, but I understood he was just trying to help. I spent the next 2 days trying to ignore the problem. I told myself it was a coincidence or some bizarre technical glitch. Still, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I decided to do one more shoot to see if the figure would appear again. I chose an abandoned cloister near an industrial zone. I arrived late in the afternoon. The sky was overcast, and there was a slight wind rustling through some dry weeds. The cloister had thick stone walls and a row of arches along one side. The place smelled like dust and old plaster. I set up my tripod and began taking photos of the courtyard. I listened carefully for any sign of footsteps or movement. Nothing. Just distant traffic sounds and the wind. I shot for about an hour, changing angles, adjusting my lens and checking the lighting. My camera felt heavy in my hands and my shoulders were stiff. I kept glancing around me, scanning the shadows. At one point I thought I saw a dark shape near the far end of the courtyard, but when I looked straight at it, there was nothing there. My stomach dropped, and my mouth felt dry. I decided I'd taken enough shots. I packed up quickly and left. That evening, I sat in front of my computer, anxious to review the new images. My fingers felt cold, and my heartbeat was a bit faster than usual. I opened the files, one by one. The first few looked normal. Then I reached an image of the courtyard from a high angle. In the background, near a crumbling pillar, there was that figure in the black overcoat. I leaned back in my chair, letting out a shaky breath. The figure was turned away, head slightly tilted, like it was listening for something. My legs felt weak and a prickly sensation ran up my arms. I flipped to the next image. The figure had moved a few feet closer to another column. Same posture, always turned away. My chest felt tight and I clenched my jaw. I didn't know what to do. I tried to edit the photos, removing the figure with a cloning tool. But every time I saved a version without the figure, I'd open the file again and see it there. It was like the figure wouldn't stay deleted. I even tried exporting a JPEG and then rechecking it. The figure remained. My breathing got shallow, and I had to step away from my computer for a moment. I walked around my living room, rubbed my hands together, and tried to calm down. I felt like I was stuck in a nightmare, but everything felt real. The next day, I printed a couple of those photos on high-quality paper. I wanted to see if the figure would appear in print. It did, clear as day, in the exact same spot where I'd seen it on the screen. I pinned those prints on a board in my office. Each time I walked past them, I had the impression the figure was slightly shifting position, like it was inching its way across the frame. I started avoiding that board because it made me feel uneasy. My chest would tighten, and I'd feel a surge of adrenaline whenever I glanced at those prints. After a few days, I decided I needed to investigate one of the locations. I chose the old cathedral where I first saw the figure. I arrived in the late afternoon, hoping to recreate the shots. The place was mostly empty. A few tourists milled around with cameras, but I didn't see anyone in a black overcoat. I waited until the sun was low, trying to match the light conditions from before. I set up my tripod in the exact spot where I had taken that original photo. I took a series of shots, checking them right away on the camera's LCD screen. Everything looked normal. No strange figures, no sign of anything out of place. Feeling a bit relieved, I wandered deeper into the cathedral's courtyard. There were tall columns and arches with patches of moss clinging to the stone. I took a few more photos. Then I caught a glimpse of something dark in my peripheral vision. I snapped my head around, but I only saw an empty walkway. My heart pounded and my skin felt clammy. I decided it was time to leave. I didn't want to push my luck. Later that night, I uploaded those new shots to my computer. I checked each one carefully. They all looked fine. No sign of the black-coated figure. I began to feel a small sense of relief. Maybe I was finally done with this. Maybe I had just imagined the shifting positions in my older photos. I spent about an hour going through them and organizing everything. Then, out of curiosity, I opened one of the older folders. I picked a random shot of the old monastery. The figure was in it, as usual, near a column. I glanced at it for a second, thinking it looked the same as before. Then I noticed something. The figure was definitely closer to the foreground than the last time I remembered. It looked bigger, like it had stepped forward. My stomach sank, and I felt lightheaded. I shut my laptop immediately and took a few deep breaths. Now I'm sitting here, telling you this story because I don't know what's going on. I keep all my files on a secure drive. Nobody else has access to them. I don't see how these images could be manipulated. Every time I try to remove the figure, it comes back. Every time I compare two shots, the figure seems to have moved between the times I viewed the photos. It's always turned away, wearing that black overcoat, hiding in some patch of shadow. My mind keeps racing with questions. I don't have any answers. All I can do is keep taking photos and hope that one day I'll open a folder and find that the figure has disappeared. Until then, every time I load up a new set of architecture shots, my heart skips a beat. I don't know if this will ever stop. I've started avoiding new photography gigs in old places. I'm thinking of switching to another type of work, maybe portraits or studio stuff. But I can't shake the feeling that no matter what I do, the figure in the black overcoat is still there, waiting for me to look again. I stepped onto campus this morning with a heavy feeling in my chest. I couldn't explain it at first. I had slept fine the night before, but there was a tension in my shoulders and a strange buzz at the back of my neck. I'd been working on a dig for months, and today I was supposed to catalog more artifacts we'd pulled from the soil. I remember thinking, what if I'm just tired? But that feeling stayed with me. It felt like something was pressing on me, something I couldn't see. My name's Daniel. I'm a professor of archaeology. I've spent years digging up pottery shards, bones, coins, and statues in different parts of the world. I've touched countless artifacts without a second thought. But this new excavation changed everything. We had stumbled upon what seemed to be a small temple site hidden under layers of dirt and debris. There were carvings on the walls and fragments of sculptures that didn't match any civilization I'd studied. From the start, it made me uneasy, and I wasn't sure why. I want to describe exactly what happened because it still feels unreal. We found a set of stone pieces that looked like parts of a larger tablet. They had symbols on them that I couldn't recognize. When I first picked one up, I felt a jolt in my wrist, almost like static electricity. I remember shaking my hand, thinking there was some chemical residue or maybe a reaction to the cold stone. Then I heard this soft whisper. It was so faint that I thought I imagined it, but the moment was distinct. I had my fingers on the artifact, my ears picked up a muttering sound, and my heart kicked against my chest. I dropped the stone piece and stepped back. One of my colleagues asked me if everything was okay. I lied and said my fingers had cramped. I tried to laugh it off, but I felt shaky. I could still hear something inside my ears, like air escaping a small crack in a window. It wasn't English. It didn't sound like Latin or Greek. It was a string of harsh consonants and a sound that made my throat tighten. I brushed it off and kept working. That night I went home, made a simple dinner, and tried to watch some TV. I couldn't focus on the show. I kept replaying that moment in my head. I thought maybe I was dehydrated. I went to bed early. Around midnight, I woke up with my ears ringing. It was the same whispered voice, speaking the same strange sounds. I sat upright in bed and turned on the light. My bedroom was silent except for the hum of the air conditioner. I stayed up for an hour, just waiting to hear it again. Nothing happened. I tried to convince myself I'd been dreaming. The next day, I returned to the dig site. I handled more of those stone fragments. Every single time I touched them, I heard that same whisper. Sometimes it lasted only a second. Other times it stretched out. It was always that same language. I couldn't pick out any recognizable words. It sounded like someone was standing behind me, whispering right into my ear. My neck hair stood up each time, and I gripped the artifact harder, trying to steady myself. I told nobody. I was afraid they'd think I was losing my mind. I wrote down some of the sounds phonetically in a notebook, but I didn't even know how to organize them. It was just a collection of jumbled letters I could barely pronounce. I tried comparing them to ancient scripts in my reference books, but I came up empty. I went home more frustrated than ever. As the days went by, I started to ignore the whispers. I figured I could power through my research. Maybe it was stress. Maybe I was just overworked. But it didn't stop. It got stronger. I felt like I was being called by something, but I had no way to answer. My colleagues seemed perfectly fine. Nobody else complained about noises. Nobody else even commented on feeling strange. I began to think there was something about my connection with those artifacts that singled me out. That thought made me uneasy, but I didn't let it stop me from doing my work. A week later, things took a turn at home. I was in my living room reading some notes when I noticed a small statue I keep on my shelf was turned. It faced inward, toward the books. I usually keep it pointed outward, toward the room. I figured I must have knocked it while cleaning. I turned it back. The next morning, I woke up and found it facing inward again. I frowned. I live alone. There's no one else to move it. But I told myself I must have bumped it without realizing. Later that day, I came home from the campus. My living room table had a few random objects, a set of keys, some coins, a TV remote. They weren't in the same spot. The keys and the coins formed a neat circle on the table. I had never arranged them like that. I remember standing there staring at the circle, my hands shaking a bit. I picked up my phone, checked the time, then put it back in my pocket. I told myself I was just being paranoid. I scattered the coins and put the keys back on a hook, but my gut churned. That night I turned off the lights and tried to sleep. I kept hearing faint creaking sounds from the living room. My apartment is old, so it's not unusual for the floors to make noise. But these were short, sharp sounds like something tapping against wood. I got up and crept out to the living room. I saw nothing move, but that weird tension in the room was thick. I could feel my pulse in my ears. I just stood there in my pajamas, eyes scanning every corner. After a minute, I turned around and went back to bed. I didn't sleep well. Over the next few days, the objects started rearranging themselves in more obvious ways. One time, I found several books stacked on my kitchen table, each open to pages that had strange symbols that kind of resembled the carvings from the dig site. Another time, I saw my shoes placed side by side in a perfect line in the hallway, with the laces looped together like a knot. I had never done that. I started to feel a tightness in my chest, like I was always on edge. My jaw was clenched more often. My appetite dropped. I drank more coffee than usual, just trying to keep my energy up. I tried to ignore everything that was happening, but I couldn't. One afternoon, I decided to get to the bottom of it. I grabbed my notebook with those phonetic scribbles of the whispers. I sat down in my study and listened to some recordings of ancient languages I had saved on my computer. I tried to see if any syllable matched. Hours went by. My eyes felt dry from staring at the screen. My notes made little sense. I heard no direct match. I slammed the notebook shut and rubbed my temples. I muttered to myself, "What am I missing?" That same night, I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling. My heart started pounding for no reason. My arms felt cold. I swung my legs off the bed, walked to the living room, and turned on a lamp. I froze when I saw the objects on the coffee table. They were arranged in a spiral. Pens, coins, a lighter, my remote, even a small decorative box. All lined up in a tight spiral pattern that matched the swirling design I'd seen on one of the temple's walls during the excavation. I remembered that carving clearly. It had been on a collapsed pillar. There was no way this was a coincidence. I approached the table and touched the remote. I felt a vibration in my fingertips. My mind raced. I looked around the apartment, expecting to see someone hiding in the corners. Nobody was there. I was alone. My breathing became shallow. My scalp tingled. I picked up the phone to call a colleague, but I realized I had no good explanation for what was happening. I put the phone down and paced the room. I felt I was being watched, but there was no one there. I had to do something. So, I decided to bring one of the smaller stone artifacts to my apartment. I wanted to see if it triggered the whispers in a controlled environment. That might sound reckless, but I was desperate. The next day, I took a piece of the stone from the lab. It was about the size of my palm, covered with 3 lines of that unreadable script. I wrapped it in a cloth and put it in my backpack. When I got home, I cleared everything off my kitchen table. I set the stone in the center. I pulled out a small handheld recorder. My plan was to talk through what I was experiencing in real time. I took a deep breath, steadied my hands, and pressed record. I touched the stone with my fingertips and listened. The whispers came instantly. It was like a breeze blowing right by my ear. I felt my shoulders tighten. My pulse thumped in my neck. I leaned closer, waiting for the words to make sense, but they never did. It was just a string of guttural sounds. While my fingers were on the stone, something rattled behind me. I spun around and saw a glass shift on the countertop. It moved about an inch on its own, making a scratching sound as it dragged across. I let go of the stone. The whispering stopped. My heart was racing and sweat lined my forehead. I pressed stop on the recorder and played it back. I heard my own breathing and a faint static hum. No whispers, no dragging sound, nothing. The audio was clear, but it didn't catch what I heard in person. That made me even more uneasy. That night, I propped a chair against my bedroom door before going to sleep. I felt silly doing it, but I wanted some sense of security. I dozed off, but I woke up around 3 a.m. to a dull thud. I turned on my bedside lamp. My bedroom door was wide open. The chair was lying on its side in the hallway. My stomach twisted. I got out of bed, heart pounding, and walked over to the door. There were marks on the floor where the chair had scraped the wood. I looked left and right. The rest of the apartment was dark. I whispered to myself, "Hello?" Nobody answered. Over the next week, the activity escalated. Sometimes I'd walk into a room and find everything on one side, like someone had swept all the items across the table in a single motion. Other times I'd hear muffled voices in the middle of the night, but whenever I tried to record them, nothing showed up on the device. I got jumpy. I started checking the corners of rooms, opening closets before I could relax. My face felt hot most of the time, like I was running a fever, but my temperature was normal. Back at the dig site, I finally told one of my colleagues, Alan, that something felt wrong about these artifacts. I didn't go into detail about the objects moving at home. I just hinted that I was hearing things. He said I was probably overwhelmed and should take a break. He offered to take over some of the cataloging. I thanked him, but I still went back to the site that evening to examine the stone walls again. I found more carvings that matched the patterns forming in my apartment. Spirals, jagged lines, and rows of those cryptic symbols. My chest got tight, and I felt a flicker of panic. I left in a hurry, making up an excuse about needing to prep for my next lecture. That night, I tried one last experiment. I placed the artifact on my coffee table in the center of the living room. I left all my lights on. I stood a few feet away, arms crossed, watching for any movement. My body was tense. My breath was shallow. After about an hour, I got tired and started pacing. Then I noticed my bookshelf. The books were sliding out one by one, about an inch each. My hands trembled. I took a step closer, and they slid back into place. I jumped. My legs felt weak. I leaned against the wall, trying to stay upright. I walked over to the artifact and picked it up. The whispering began. I held it close, listening, trying to pick out patterns in the sounds. My eyes watered from the strain of focusing so hard. I whispered back, "What do you want?" I don't know why I did that. I got no response except for a slight vibration in my hand. I clenched my teeth. My mouth went dry. Then, without warning, the light in the lamp flickered and the whispering cut off. I'm at a point now where I can't pretend this isn't real. The artifacts trigger something. Whatever it is, it's in my home. It moves things. It forms shapes that look like the carvings in that temple. It tries to speak in a language I don't understand. My body reacts by tensing up, and I feel my heart beating so loudly I can't hear anything else. I keep expecting to find a rational explanation, but the evidence piles up. Scratched floors, rearranged objects, shifting furniture, the feeling of being watched at all hours of the day. I don't know what to do next. I'm not sleeping well. I'm jumpy around my colleagues. My phone is filled with half-written notes about the symbols and the scribbles of the whispers. My apartment feels like a trap. Sometimes I step in and feel like I'm intruding on something I can't see. The hair on my arms stands up and I can't breathe right. I've tried leaving the windows open, hoping fresh air might change the atmosphere. No luck. I'm worried about losing my mind, but everything I see and hear is real to me. The dig is ongoing and the team is excited about the new findings. I'm the only one who's hearing these whispers. I'm the only one seeing things move on their own. I haven't told anyone the full story. I feel trapped by the fear of looking crazy. But I can't deny what happens every time I touch those artifacts. I'm sitting here now, writing this down in my living room. The artifact is wrapped in a cloth inside my bedroom closet. I can hear occasional shifting sounds from the other room. My eyes dart to the hallway, but I see nothing. My throat is tight, and I keep swallowing to clear it. My legs are sore from the constant tension. When I close my eyes, I see those spiral patterns. I hear those whispers. They keep warning me, I think, but I don't know what they want me to do. Every time I try to ignore them, things escalate. I'm stuck in a loop. Tomorrow, I plan to gather every piece of data I can and see if there's a specialist who might help. I don't even know what kind of specialist deals with this sort of phenomenon. But I can't keep living like this. I can't keep jumping at every small noise in my own home. I need answers, and I need them soon. If these whispers are a warning, then I need to figure out what the threat is. If it's something else, then I have to figure out how to shut it down. Because right now I feel like a stranger in my own life, unable to trust my own senses. I hear another sound in the closet, a soft thump. I look My entire body tightens. I look toward the door, but I'm too tired to check again. I'll wait until morning. Maybe it'll be quiet then. Maybe I'll be able to focus on the research. Maybe I'll find a clue in those books that will help me decode the whispers. I don't know. All I know is that I'm not making this up. Something's happening, and it started the moment I touched those artifacts. I can't take back what I did. All I can do is face it one day at a time until I discover the truth. I never expected a package like that. It came in a thick envelope with my name spelled out in neat black letters. Inside, I found legal papers telling me I was now the owner of a Victorian mansion left behind by some distant uncle I had never met. I remember standing in my office with the documents spread across my desk, feeling my palms get damp as I flipped through the pages. I had sold real estate for years, but I'd never owned anything like this. The idea of taking on a big project seemed exciting at first. I pictured a straightforward renovation, a quick sale, and a solid commission in my pocket. But the moment I stepped onto the property, I felt a strange heaviness in my stomach, like something was off. I'm used to old houses with creaking floors and musty smells, but this place felt different from the first second. The mansion stood 3 stories high, with turrets and pointed roofs, its wood siding weathered and faded. There was a long driveway leading up to a tall iron gate. The gate stuck in place when I tried to push it open, so I had to yank it until the metal groaned. Beyond it, an overgrown yard stretched around the entire structure. Weeds and vines wrapped around porch posts and half-buried statues. I heard birds rustling in a few dead trees. I saw a pair of crows perched on a cracked stone bird bath. They eyed me, but they didn't move when I walked by. I stepped onto the porch, noticing a few loose boards under my feet. The front door was thick, dark wood with a stained glass window near the top. I reached for the antique doorknob. It felt cold, colder than the air around me. When I turned the knob, the door resisted for a moment before swinging open with a loud squeak. Dust particles floated in the air of the entry hall. Light from outside illuminated swirling specks. I could taste the stale atmosphere in my mouth every time I inhaled. The place was huge. A wide staircase curved up to the second floor. Rooms branched off on both sides of the foyer. I took a few steps forward, my shoes leaving footprints in the thick layer of dust. Every step brought an echo, like the house was acknowledging my presence. The plaster on the walls looked cracked, and pieces of wallpaper curled at the edges. I saw a few cobwebs in corners, and around a chandelier overhead. Everything looked dated, like the house had been stuck in another time. I ran my hand along a wooden banister. It felt smooth, almost oily, like someone had polished it recently, despite the dust covering everything else. I moved into the first room on the right. It seemed like a sitting room with a pair of large windows facing the front yard. A grimy mirror hung on one wall. It was framed with ornate brass details shaped like ivy leaves. I looked into the mirror and noticed something I couldn't explain. The reflection didn't seem to match the room exactly. There was a tall bookshelf in the reflection that wasn't there behind me in real life. I turned around, expecting to see it, but the wall was bare except for old wallpaper and a fireplace. I turned back to the mirror, and it still showed that bookshelf. My heart thudded a little harder in my chest. I tried to brush it off. Maybe I was seeing a leftover reflection from an earlier daydream or something. I stepped closer to the mirror, leaned in, and squinted. The image stayed the same. The strange bookshelf was there, and I could see a few antique chairs that definitely weren't in the room behind me. I felt a chill crawl along my arms. I shook my head, took a breath, and left the sitting room. In the next few days, I brought in some basic supplies. I had a plan. Tear up the old floors, repaint walls, fix the plumbing, then flip the place. On the first morning, I began clearing out debris in the foyer. I dragged out heavy boards and garbage. I cleaned a few windows to bring in more light. By evening, I had removed most of the crumbling wallpaper in the entry hall. I was tired and covered in dust, so I decided to call it a day. I stepped outside, locked the front door, and drove off to a small motel I'd booked. When I returned the next morning, my stomach dropped. The wallpaper was back on the walls exactly as it had been before I started tearing it down. It looked just as old and torn in the corners. Even the dust and cobwebs I'd cleaned were back. It was like I had never touched the place. I had spent hours removing all that material, and now it was right there as if my work had never happened. I felt a pang of unease spread through my chest, but I tried a different approach. I went upstairs and removed a heavy dresser from what I guessed was the master bedroom. I carried it down to the yard and left it outside, planning to haul it to a junkyard. Then I started fixing a few broken steps on the main staircase. I hammered new wood into place. The steps felt solid under my foot when I was done. That night I drove back to my motel, trying to ignore the weird tension in my shoulders. The next day I walked in and saw that the staircase was back to its original broken state. The new planks I'd hammered in were gone. I cursed under my breath and ran outside. That dresser I'd dragged to the yard had vanished. I found it back in the master bedroom, sitting exactly where it had been before. I stood there, my heart pounding, wondering if I was losing my mind. There was no sign of any forced entry. Nothing indicated someone else had come in overnight to undo my work. Everything was locked when I left, and it was still locked when I returned. This wasn't normal. I decided to stay overnight. I thought maybe I'd catch whoever was messing with me. I set up a cot in the front parlor. I left the lights on in most rooms, figuring I'd see or hear something if it happened again. By midnight, I was still sitting on the cot, wide awake. My body felt tense. My shoulders ached. Every noise made me jump. A creak in the rafters, a gust of wind rattling the windows. Around 1 a.m, I heard a soft dragging sound from upstairs, like furniture moving. I grabbed a flashlight and climbed the stairs quietly, trying not to let them creak too much. At the top, I noticed the hallway looked darker than before. A few light bulbs I had turned on earlier were now off. I pointed my flashlight down the corridor. The beam revealed dust motes floating around, but I didn't see anything else. Then I heard what sounded like a soft scraping. I followed it to a room at the end of the hall. The door was slightly ajar. I nudged it open and swept the flashlight around. The furniture was in the same position as before. I stood still, listening to my own breathing. After a few seconds, the sound stopped completely, leaving only the quiet hum of my flashlight. I was shaking a little. My hands felt clammy and my mouth was dry. I stayed there for maybe 5 more minutes, waiting for something else to happen, but nothing moved or made any noise. When morning came, I went downstairs, and sure enough, any small fixes I'd tried to do before I went to bed had been reversed. The nails I'd driven into a loose banister were gone. A loose doorknob I'd tightened was back to wobbling. It felt like the house itself refused to let me change it. I paced around the foyer, rubbing my neck. I felt a headache forming at my temples. I couldn't figure out how this was happening. A week passed with me trying the same thing in different rooms, at different times. Every single improvement vanished by the next morning. One afternoon, I walked through the upstairs hallway looking at the old pictures on the walls. They showed people in stiff, old-fashioned clothes, standing in front of the same mansion. Their expressions were blank, and their eyes looked strange in those faded photographs. I recognized one face from the documents my uncle's lawyer had sent. He was older, wearing a suit with tails, standing at the base of the front steps. I felt an uncomfortable weight in my chest when I realized his eyes seemed to follow me as I walked past. I tried to ignore it. I kept going until I found the library. The library door was heavy, with carved patterns of leaves and vines. Inside, the walls were lined with shelves, most of them empty. The air felt stale and the floors creaked with every step. In the far corner, I saw a large mirror. Its frame was dark wood, stained and chipped at the edges. The glass was cloudy. I switched on a table lamp next to it. I looked at myself in the mirror. My hair was a mess and my t-shirt was filthy from the day's work. Then I noticed something behind me in the reflection. It looked like a figure wearing an old suit standing near one of the shelves. My stomach lurched. My breath caught in my throat. I spun around fast, aiming my flashlight at the spot. There was nothing there. I turned back to the mirror, and the figure was gone. My throat felt tight. I could hear my heart thumping in my ears. That night I couldn't sleep. I left the bedroom lights on and laid on the cot, staring at the cracked ceiling. The wind outside made the walls groan. Around 2 in the morning, I heard the faint sound of laughter coming from downstairs. It was distant, muffled. I sat up, grabbed my flashlight, and walked to the top of the stairs. The air felt thicker than usual, like it was pressing against my skin. I could feel my pulse pounding in my hands. Each step I took seemed to echo forever. The laughter stopped as soon as I reached the bottom step. I stood there in the darkness, shining my flashlight around. The foyer looked the same. No sign of anyone. I felt a wave of goosebumps on my arms. My mind raced with possibilities. Maybe it was just the house settling, or maybe I was imagining it. Still, I checked every room, shining light into corners and behind furniture. Nothing. I decided the next day to inspect the basement, hoping I'd find some old switchboard or mechanical trick that might explain the weird resets. I found a dusty door under the staircase that led down to a cramped, dark space. The wooden steps groaned under my weight. A dull smell of damp earth hit me as I reached the bottom. My flashlight swept across stone walls and a concrete floor. Broken crates and old tools lay scattered around. A rotted wooden workbench sat against one wall. At first, I saw nothing unusual. Then my flashlight beam settled on a row of mirrors leaning against the far wall. They looked similar to the ones upstairs, each with an ornate frame. My pulse quickened. I stepped closer, dust floating up around my shoes. I saw my own reflection in one of the mirrors, but the background looked different. It showed a well-lit basement with neat shelves, fresh paint on the walls, and no dust. I moved to the mirror next to it and saw another version of the same basement, but this time there were stacks of boxes labeled with dates. The next mirror showed a basement that looked older, with fewer objects. I stepped back, feeling sweat on my forehead. These mirrors showed different times, like snapshots of the house's past. I heard my own breathing get heavier. My mouth felt dry. I tried to calm down, thinking this might be some old trick or a leftover from the previous owner's collection, but there was no logical reason for these images to appear. When I went back upstairs, I looked at each mirror I had seen before. In every one, I saw little hints of a different era. One hallway mirror showed electric lamps that hadn't been in the hallway 5 minutes before. Another showed a rug that no longer existed. In some reflections, I glimpsed people walking around in vintage clothing, going about their days as if the house was in its prime. My fingers twitched with nervous tension every time I caught sight of them. I felt like a trespasser in my own house, and no matter what repairs I attempted, the house reset itself at night. Over time, I tried to film it. I set up a camera to record the foyer overnight, hoping to catch the renovation vanishing. But the footage only showed static after midnight. When I woke up, everything was undone again. Each time it happened, I felt more frustrated and anxious. I found myself snapping at any little noise, jumping at every flicker of light. I was drinking too much coffee, hardly sleeping, and always scanning the corners of rooms, expecting to see someone or something lurking there. One morning I decided I'd had enough. I tossed my tools in the trunk of my car and sat in the driver's seat, gripping the steering wheel. My heart pounded. I told myself I was leaving for good, that I wasn't going to come back. But then I remembered I still owned the place. I still had a responsibility to figure out what to do with it. Selling it as is didn't feel right, since I was sure anyone who bought it would face the same bizarre issues. I took a few deep breaths and went back in. I walked around examining the rooms. I saw that the furniture, wallpaper, and fixtures all looked exactly as they did on day one. The mirrors still held those strange reflections. The floors creaked as I passed the sitting room, and I thought I heard a low murmur of voices behind me. I spun around, shining my flashlight, but I was alone. I spent that entire day trying to find any kind of official record about the house. I searched old closets, rummaged through drawers, and flipped through old photos and letters. Most of it was unreadable, decayed, or irrelevant. But the more I looked, the more I realized that every single item seemed tied to a moment in time that the house refused to let go. It felt like the place was stuck in multiple eras at once. Each mirror offered a window to those other times. Every night, the house yanked itself back to some original state, undoing everything new. By evening, I sat at the bottom of the grand staircase, covered in dust and feeling my legs ache. My back hurt from bending over old trunks. I stared at the peeling wallpaper, waiting for the moment it would restore itself again. I heard the ticking of an old clock in the hallway. My heart beat in sync with that clock, and I could almost feel the tension coil in my stomach, expecting something to move or some voice to echo. But the house was silent. That night, I curled up on the cot and waited. I listened for footsteps, voices, or scraping noises. I felt the hair on my arms stand up every time the wind pushed against the windows. At some point, I drifted off. When I opened my eyes in the early morning light, I saw the same old walls with the same old wallpaper. Every last renovation attempt was gone, just like before. The tension in my chest twisted into a knot. I stood up, walked to the window, and looked outside. The grass was still overgrown, the statues still covered in vines. Nothing had changed. I haven't fixed the mansion, and I don't know if I ever will. But now I understand it a bit better. It clings to its past, resetting itself every night. The mirrors show me moments from decades ago, with people who seem as real as anyone I see on the street. I can't explain how it happens, and I don't think I ever will. All I know is that I own a place that doesn't want to move on. Every time I cross the threshold, my chest tightens and my ears strain for the smallest sound. I watch the mirrors out of the corner of my eye, ready to catch a glimpse of someone walking by in an old suit or dress, holding onto their piece of history. And in the morning, the house erases all signs of my presence as though it wants to remain exactly as it was, forever. I pulled into the driveway around noon, feeling sweat trickle down the back of my neck. My car's air conditioning had stopped working an hour earlier, so the stale heat hit me the second I opened the door. The house in front of me looked old and quiet. The yard had tall grass and a few scattered stones that looked like they'd been part of a small path at some point. I felt a tug in my chest, like I was on the edge of something new and uncertain. I liked the idea of being alone out here with my brushes and canvas. I had big plans for the next few weeks, mostly to paint in peace and see if I could capture something different. I'd been stuck in a creative loop for months, and I thought a change of scenery might help. I unlocked the front door with a key that felt a little rusty, and it took me a second to get the door open. The hinges groaned when I walked inside. The first thing I noticed was the smell. Wood and dust, plus something faint that reminded me of old paint. There wasn't much furniture. I saw an empty living room with bare floorboards and a single window that looked out onto the backyard. I heard the wind outside rustling through tree branches. It sounded distant, like a low whooshing that came and went in short bursts. I carried in my suitcase, my crate of painting supplies, and the canvases I'd primed back in the city. The house didn't have central air, so I opened some windows to let in a breeze. The floors creaked under my feet while I walked around, trying to figure out where to set up. A small side room near the living room caught my eye because of its large window facing west. I thought it would be good for afternoon light. I placed my easel there and spread out my tubes of paint, brushes, and palette on a makeshift work table. I decided to spend the rest of the afternoon unpacking. The kitchen had an old fridge that hummed a bit. I turned it on and checked if it cooled. It started to get cold after a while, so I felt relieved I wouldn't have to invest in a cooler or something. I placed a few groceries I'd brought inside. I kept hearing these little creaks in the hallways, but I figured it was the house settling. It didn't scare me, but it kept me on edge. I was alone, and every tiny sound felt amplified. Later, I tried to paint a simple, still life. I set up a bowl with some fruit, but my mind wasn't in it. I kept looking around, noticing how the light hit different corners of the walls. The paint on the walls looked old, peeling in some spots. My brushstrokes felt forced, like I was just slapping color around for no reason. After an hour, I gave up and decided to explore the outside. I walked behind the house and found a short fence with several boards missing. Beyond that was a stretch of land with tall weeds and a couple of pine trees. The sky looked hazy and bright. I heard birds chirping in the distance, but they sounded far away, like they were barely interested in this place. I went back inside around dusk. My stomach growled, so I made a quick sandwich. I sat in the living room on a folding chair I'd brought. I watched the light fade through the window. Something about twilight always gave me a strange feeling. It's the time right before night fully settles and everything feels uncertain. The shapes outside become less clear. Shadows stretch across the ground. Inside, the house got darker in that slow, quiet way. I turned on a small lamp and decided to go to bed early. I felt tired from the drive and the heat. That first night, I slept in a sleeping bag on the floor of the bedroom. There was a thick layer of dust on the windowsill, so I cracked the window open for fresh air. I remember waking up at some point in the night because of a rustling sound in the hallway. I thought maybe a mouse or some small animal had gotten in. I listened for a minute, then heard nothing else, so I drifted back to sleep. In the morning, I checked my canvas from the day before. It looked the same. Still just a half-finished still life. Nothing unusual about it. I decided to walk into town to buy some cleaning supplies and maybe some better lights for my work area. The town was about a 15-minute drive, but I wanted the exercise. The country road didn't have a sidewalk, but there wasn't much traffic. I saw a few cars go by, and each time I got a small wave or nod from the drivers. People here seemed more relaxed than in the city. After picking up what I needed, I headed back and spent the rest of the day clearing out the side room, dusting the windowsill, and setting up a proper workspace. By the time late afternoon rolled around, I felt sweat soaking my shirt. The sun hit that west-facing window directly, and the heat gathered inside. I opened the window to let some air circulate. I decided to start a new painting, hoping the fresh environment would spark something. I set up a blank canvas and started painting a simple view of the yard. I found it relaxing. The colors flowed better than they had the day before. I painted until I lost track of time. When I finally stepped back, my body ached from standing so long. Outside, the sky was turning orange. Twilight was coming again. I stopped to wash my brushes and then sat on the porch for a moment, enjoying the cooler evening air. I heard leaves rustling in the breeze, and the fading glow of the sun seemed to stretch across the sky. I felt calm. That night, I slept more soundly. I didn't hear any strange noises, or maybe I was just too tired to notice. In the morning, I got up, brushed my teeth, and made some coffee. I went straight to my new painting to see how it looked in the daylight. My eyes locked on it, and I felt my heart rate kick up. The scene I had painted was still there, but something was off. I could see new details that I hadn't painted. There were shapes in the painting's background that resembled a couple of people standing near the fence. They weren't detailed, more like outlines, but it was clear there were two figures there. That wasn't in my original painting. I tried to remember if I'd painted something and forgotten about it, but I knew I hadn't. I had been painting only the yard, the trees, and the fence line. I touched the canvas, running my fingertips over the paint. It was dry. The outlines felt like they'd been there all along, but I knew they hadn't. My throat felt tight and a wave of nausea rolled through me. I tried to shake it off, telling myself that maybe I'd painted something abstract and forgot. But it didn't feel right. I decided not to think about it too hard. I figured maybe I just got carried away and forgot. That afternoon, I went outside to check the fence. There were no footprints or any sign that someone had been there. The grass was tall and undisturbed. I felt a little uneasy, but I kept telling myself it was my imagination. I spent the day painting another canvas, this time focusing on a corner of the living room. I was careful with my brush strokes, making sure I painted only what I saw. The wooden floor, the one window, and the dusty corner with a small crack. I finished around sunset and left the canvas to dry in the side room. At night, the house felt especially quiet. I couldn't shake a nervous tension that settled in my stomach. I heard the wind outside, and a few times I thought I heard a soft tapping on the wall. I stood still, waiting for it to happen again, but it didn't repeat. Eventually, I tried to sleep, though I tossed and turned for a long time. The next morning, I woke up early. My eyes felt heavy, like I hadn't rested. I went straight to check my new painting. The second I saw it, my stomach clenched. The canvas had changed again. In one corner, I saw the same two shapes from the first painting, but this time they were standing right by the window. I leaned in and saw small smudges that looked like arms reaching up. It looked like they were about to enter the room. My hands started shaking and I took a step back, almost tripping over a stool behind me. I felt a strong need to check every window in the house. I walked around, looking through each window, but saw no one. The doors were still locked. I couldn't explain it. I decided I had to paint something else, maybe something more cheerful, to see if that changed what was happening. I set up a fresh canvas and did a quick landscape of the sky above the house. I used broad strokes of blue and white, trying to replicate the clouds I saw. I finished in about an hour. I was sweating the whole time, checking over my shoulder every few minutes. I felt paranoid, but I wanted to see if the painting would morph again overnight. I spent the rest of the day cleaning and trying to distract myself. I looked around the house for any hidden compartments or old items that could explain these weird changes, but I found nothing. I even went into the crawl space under the house, shining a flashlight around. It was empty except for some spider webs and dirt. My heart pounded the whole time I was down there. The air felt stuffy and thick. That evening, I cooked some pasta, but I could barely eat. My stomach felt jumpy. I kept glancing at my new painting of the sky, worried it would change in front of my eyes. But it stayed the same while I was watching. Finally, I put it in a closet and shut the door, hoping that somehow that would prevent anything from happening. I felt silly doing it, but I was desperate to keep the painting under control. I went to bed early again, but I couldn't sleep. I lay there, staring at the ceiling. Around midnight, I heard a faint scraping sound from the side room. It made my heart pound so hard I heard it in my ears. I got up, walked into the hallway and flipped on the light. The scraping sound stopped. I waited, listening. I could hear my own breathing and the tick of my wristwatch. Then, a light rustle came from inside the closet where I'd placed the new painting. I stood there, afraid to open the door. My hands felt clammy. My fingers tingled. After a few seconds, the sound stopped again. I forced myself to open the closet door. I stared at the painting. It was dark, but I switched on a small lamp. At first glance, I didn't see a difference. The sky looked normal, just like I'd left it. I moved the lamp closer, scanning every inch. In the lower corner, where I'd left the canvas blank, I saw a small shape that I hadn't painted. It looked like a shadowy figure walking on a flat stretch of land. I closed my eyes for a second, wishing it would disappear. When I opened them, it was still there. My mouth went dry. I shut the closet door and went back to my bedroom, locking the door behind me. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next day, I stood outside on the porch, trying to pull myself together. I watched the sun rise and felt the cool morning air on my face. I thought about leaving the house for good, but I'd spent a lot of money to rent this place, and I still felt a strange pull to figure out what was happening. My mind jumped to the idea that maybe these paintings were showing me something. It felt crazy, but I couldn't ignore it. The painting showed these figures, always at twilight or close to it. They seemed to be moving closer each time, like they were approaching me. I decided to test it. I started a new canvas around noon. This time I painted a simple image of the front yard and the gravel driveway. I took my time, making sure I only painted what I saw. I left out any suggestion of people, any shapes in the distance. Then I placed the painting in the living room, propped up against the wall, away from the other canvases. I made a point to check on it every hour until sunset. It never changed while I was watching. But around twilight I stepped out to the porch to catch the sunset, and I stayed out there a bit longer than normal. When I came back inside, I went straight to the living room. My heart sank. The painting had changed. In the background, near the edge of the driveway, I saw something that looked like a car parked on the side of the road. It looked old and beat up. I hadn't painted that. I opened the front door and looked out at the driveway. There was nothing there. The road was empty. My hands shook as I closed the door. I could feel sweat on my forehead. It was happening again. I paced around the house, checking the windows, looking for any car. There was no one around. I couldn't think of any logical explanation. I sat down, drank some water, and tried to calm my breathing. By now, my body felt tense and twitchy. My muscles ached from the stress. I went back to the painting and stared at the car in it. It looked like it had a dent in the driver's side door. I couldn't figure out why that detail stuck out to me, but it did. It felt too specific. It wasn't random. Later that same evening, I heard an engine rumbling outside. I ran to the window and saw a car pulling up. It matched the one in my painting right down to the dent. A man got out and looked around, probably checking directions on his phone. My heart pounded. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. I watched him for a few minutes until he got back in the car and drove away. My legs felt weak. The painting had shown me an event that hadn't happened yet. But then it did. I sank down on the couch, feeling all the energy drain out of me. It was real. For the next few days, I forced myself to stop painting, hoping that would end whatever was happening. But every night I heard noises from the side room. Sometimes I heard soft clicks or scraping. When I checked the canvases, I always found new details added. One showed a lamp falling over. Another showed a door left wide open. These little things started happening in real life a day or two later. The lamp in the living room got knocked over by a gust of wind through the open window. The front door once blew open after I forgot to latch it. Each time, the painting matched the event before it happened. I felt trapped in a loop. I considered throwing the paintings away or destroying them, but I worried that might trigger something worse. Instead, I moved them all into the side room and covered them with old sheets. I tried to ignore them, but the house wouldn't let me. It creaked at night, and I swore I heard muffled movement behind the door. I kept thinking about those shadowy figures in the car that appeared. The events were small, but the pattern felt undeniable. One afternoon, I packed a bag and got ready to leave. I didn't want to stay anymore. I'd had enough of the unexplained changes and the tension that made me jump at every sound. But while I was walking to my car, I glanced back at the house. The sun was hitting the windows in a strange way, almost blinding me. I stepped back, shielded my eyes, and hesitated. Something inside told me that the moment I left, I'd never understand what was going on. My chest felt tight with uncertainty. I decided to wait one more day. I wanted to see if there was a final painting that would show something bigger. Maybe I wanted closure. That night, the twilight came again. I sat in the living room, looking at the sheets covering the canvases in the side room. My hands were sweaty, and my heart thumped. I kept imagining the sheets moving. I sat there for hours. Around midnight, I heard the scraping noise. It was louder this time, like a knife edge dragging over wood. I stood up, walked to the side room, and opened the door. The sheets looked untouched, but I could see faint outlines through the fabric. I couldn't see the full images, just shapes. I took a breath and yanked the sheet off the nearest painting. My stomach flipped. The painting showed me standing on the front porch. My face looked tense, and I was staring at something in the distance. In the painting, the sky was a pale purple, the color it gets at twilight. That meant it hadn't happened yet. I looked closer and noticed a figure standing near the fence like a silhouette, watching me. My pulse pounded. I glanced out the window toward the fence, but it was too dark to see anything. Then I threw the sheet back over the canvas, closed the door, and locked it. I couldn't handle more. Now I'm sitting here, writing this down in the simplest way I can manage. The sun is just rising, and I'm counting the minutes until twilight comes again. I have my bag ready to go, but a part of me wants to see if that moment on the porch happens exactly like the painting showed. My body feels tense and exhausted. My heart hasn't stopped pounding since I looked at that last canvas. I feel like I'm standing on the edge of something I can't explain. The paintings keep shifting, and they keep showing things that happen later. I don't have a way to stop it or understand it. I only know that every brushstroke I left on those canvases has its own life now. I'm not going to wait forever. If I see that figure at the fence this evening, I'll leave right after. I can't stomach the idea of staying here any longer than that. But if the painting is right and I do see someone there, then I'll know for sure this isn't some dream or trick of my mind. It's real. These images are changing on their own, and they're showing me events that haven't happened yet. My breath keeps catching in my throat when I think about it. I don't know what's behind this, and I don't want to find out. Maybe I'll burn the canvases later, or maybe I'll just abandon them here. I don't have an answer. All I have is the next few hours. After that, I'm gone. That's the only plan I can handle right now. I noticed something was wrong the moment I stepped into the reading room on a late Tuesday afternoon. It was that feeling you get when the air feels heavier than usual and the silence seems off. I remember pausing at the threshold, letting my eyes adjust to the dim light and noticing a few books stacked on a table that I knew was supposed to be clear. Right away, I felt my stomach tighten. That's how it started. My name's Miguel, and I've been the head librarian here for 7 years. I know every corner of this building. I know the chill in the air when you pass through the corridor to the archives. I know the faint squeak of the wooden floors near the historical volumes section. I also know our regular visitors, college students, a few professors, and the occasional curious local. I've always prided myself on keeping everything in order. It's not an obsession, it's my job, and I've been good at it. 2 weeks ago, I found the first odd set of books. 3 volumes were on a shelf near the front desk. I had never seen them placed together like that, and their titles formed a phrase. That phrase read something like, "Rise above foundations." At first, I just assumed a visitor had placed them in a strange order. I put them back in their correct spots. I didn't think much of it. But the next day, I found more. This time, the titles formed a longer sentence. It was something about bricks, mortar, and a hidden plan. I wish I'd written down the exact words, but I was in a rush and it seemed too odd to matter. I just wanted to get them back to the right places. I work with a small team, 2 library assistants and a security guard who does rounds in the evenings. I asked them if they had noticed anything strange, and they shrugged. Everyone said the same thing. They hadn't seen anyone messing with the shelves. The security guard, Edgar, said it looked like a prank. But he also noted that the cameras in the reading room didn't pick up anything unusual at night. This library is old, so our cameras aren't the best, and some corners don't have coverage. Still, the fact that nobody had been caught rearranging the books was unsettling. A week went by. The rearrangements continued, and each time the phrases got longer. They always hinted at something about the building's structure. One phrase said, "Layers of stone conceal the truth." Another read, "Written in old plans." It was like a series of clues, but I couldn't figure out what they were pointing to. I felt unsettled. My chest felt tight every time I walked into a room and saw a set of books lined up in this bizarre pattern. It wasn't just a random scattering of titles. It was always a coherent line of text, like a puzzle someone wanted me to read. After a few nights of poor sleep, I decided to dig into the library's historical records. This building goes back to the early 1900s. It used to be a city hall of sorts, then became a school, then got turned into a library in the 1970s. We have old floor plans, newspaper clippings, and official documents in our archives. They're usually all in boxes with labels on top. I remember opening the first box. My hands were shaking a bit. I don't know why. Maybe I was expecting to see something that would confirm my suspicions. Instead, I found a bunch of standard paperwork and old library policies. Nothing about hidden construction details. So I grabbed another box. That was when things got strange. Some documents were missing. I checked the index of that box, which someone from the staff had typed up years ago, and I saw references to a blueprint and an original design proposal from 1905. But those items weren't there. I felt a rising tension in my gut. I closed my eyes for a moment, trying to stay calm. Then I rummaged through more folders and found one labeled Building Renovation 1920. Inside, there was a single page with a stamp on it. The text was almost illegible, but it mentioned something about a sealed chamber and a foundation stone. I started to sweat. It was the first time I had seen something that might connect to the weird book phrases on the shelves. I took that folder to my office. I locked the door and examined it under a bright desk lamp. The paper felt brittle. It smelled like dust and old glue. The words sealed chamber showed up twice. I also saw a mention of workers refusing to proceed. It looked like a piece of a larger document. There were references to a second page, but that page wasn't there. I got up, paced around the office a bit, and tried to think about who might be messing with the records. It could be a staff member, but that didn't make sense. They would have told me if they found something this strange, right? Unless they were playing some kind of elaborate prank. But for what reason? Over the next few days, I spent most of my time in the archives. The library was functioning as usual, but I was distracted. My assistants handled most of the front desk tasks. Meanwhile, I sifted through boxes and files. I found more inconsistencies in the historical documents. A lot of them referenced older repairs or expansions to the building, but pages were missing or scrambled. Once, I came across a folder that looked intact at first glance, but inside, the text had been replaced with random short paragraphs about something else entirely. It looked official, but had no relation to the building. My heart was pounding. My fingers trembled when I lifted each page, expecting to see more nonsense. Sometimes I'd see the word foundation, or bricks, or unknown section repeated. Then the rest of the text would look like gibberish. Every evening I'd check the main shelves before closing. I always found at least one or two new messages. They kept referring to an old story about how this building was constructed on top of something older. There was a phrase one night that said, "Refuge built upon sacred remains." I felt my breath catch in my throat. I couldn't figure out what it meant, but it made me uneasy. My mind was racing with ideas. I wondered if the building had some secret basement or corridor that I didn't know about. I decided to bring Edgar, the security guard, into the loop. He was the most level-headed guy on the team. One evening after closing, I led him down to the archives. I showed him the messed up documents, the missing pages, and the cryptic phrases that I had managed to piece together. He scratched his beard, frowned, and said, "Maybe we should check the basement." The library has a small basement where we keep some old furniture, broken chairs, and leftover construction materials. It's damp and smells like mold. We headed down there with flashlights. We rummaged through boxes and dusty shelves. We didn't find anything unusual at first, but in the far corner, we noticed a stack of bricks piled against the wall. It looked like someone had tried to patch up something. The bricks weren't laid in neat rows like a normal wall. They were stacked in a rough shape, and the cement between them looked messy. Edgar tapped on it. The sound was solid, but there was a slight echo behind it. I leaned in, put my ear against the bricks, and knocked softly. It felt like there was some space back there. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I felt beads of sweat forming on my forehead. I looked at Edgar, and he shrugged. We both decided to leave it alone for the night. We weren't equipped to knock down a wall without clearance. The next morning, I went to our collection of building-related documents again. I couldn't find anything about a wall being put up in that part of the basement. I tried to find the head of maintenance, Mr. Reyes, to see if he knew anything. He told me that wall had been there for as long as he could remember. He'd never inspected it closely. I didn't push him further because I didn't want to sound paranoid. I had a feeling that if I mentioned the weird messages, he'd think I was losing it. I turned back to the main library floors. That day, the books were arranged in a new message that said, "Truth lies beyond the second layer." It was spelled out across 6 volumes. I could see people around me, some visitors reading in corners, oblivious to what was happening. I pulled Edgar aside and told him we had to look behind that basement wall. He wasn't thrilled, but he agreed to help me do a quick check after hours. By the time evening came, I was a nervous wreck. My hands were sweaty, and I kept glancing at the clock. When the last visitor left, we locked the doors and headed downstairs. Edgar had found a small hammer and chisel in the maintenance closet. We carried flashlights and wore simple masks to avoid inhaling too much dust. We tapped the bricks and tried to wedge the chisel into the cracks. Some of the mortar crumbled without much effort. The smell of old cement and mold hit me right away. My eyes watered. Edgar coughed and covered his mouth. We pried out a few bricks. It was a slow process, and every time one came loose, it made a scraping noise. After removing about 7 bricks, we shined the flashlight inside. There was a narrow gap leading to a darker space. I aimed my light in that direction. The beam showed a cramped area that looked like an unfinished room. Dust swirled in the air. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my neck. Edgar muttered something under his breath, but I couldn't make it out. I was too focused on the black space beyond. We pushed more bricks aside until there was an opening big enough to squeeze through. I felt a rush of stale air come out. It smelled like earth, dust, and a hint of something metallic. I climbed in first, carefully stepping over loose rubble. The flashlight beam swept across a small chamber with rough stone walls. There was a rusted metal crate in one corner. It looked old, with rivets along the edges. I stepped closer, ignoring the chill running down my spine. Edgar was right behind me, breathing hard. I could hear him shifting his weight on the gravelly floor. I bent down and tried the latch on the crate. It was stuck. Edgar handed me the chisel, and I pried it open with a sharp clang. Inside, there were old papers, rolled up drawings, and a few small items wrapped in cloth. My pulse was racing. I pulled out one of the papers. It looked like a blueprint with a date in the corner, 1904. The lines showed a plan for the building, but it was different from the official version I had seen. It showed extra corridors and a large room beneath the library. My breath caught in my throat. Edgar leaned in close to see. We unwrapped one of the cloth bundles. Inside was a metal plaque tarnished with age. The inscription was hard to read, but I saw the phrase, "Original Foundation." I felt a sudden surge of adrenaline. All the strange book messages and the missing documents pointed to something like this, something hidden behind that basement wall. My mind spun with questions. Why was it sealed? Who had put these items here? And why did they keep messing with the library records? Just as I was about to pick up another bundle, Edgar tapped me on the shoulder. He whispered that we should leave the room as it was. I agreed. I realized we didn't have any official permission to break through a wall, and we needed to handle this carefully. My hands were shaking with excitement, but also fear. I could feel a fine layer of dust settling on my face, and I felt a headache coming on from the stale air. We tucked everything back into the crate as best we could and climbed out through the hole. Then we stacked the bricks to conceal the opening again, at least well enough that no one would notice at a glance. We locked up and went back upstairs. My heart was still pounding, my shirt was damp with sweat. That night I barely slept. I tossed and turned, thinking about what we found. I didn't know what to do next. If I reported this to the city, they might come in and rip out that wall, or they might accuse me of damaging library property. At the same time, it was clear that someone, or something, was orchestrating these messages with the books, trying to guide me to that hidden chamber. The next morning, I checked the shelves again. No new messages. The library felt quiet, almost too quiet. I kept expecting something else to happen, but nothing did. The entire day, I drifted through my tasks. My assistants asked if I was feeling okay. I just said I was tired. Edgar walked by a few times and I caught his eye. We didn't need words to acknowledge what we'd seen. I could tell he was still shaken. Later that afternoon, I returned to the archives. I wanted to see if anything had changed overnight. I walked in, flipped on the lights, and approached the main table. My heart dropped when I saw one of the old folders from the missing documents was now sitting there, looking untouched. But I knew it hadn't been there the day before. My throat went dry. I opened it. Inside, I found a typed page that looked brand new. It talked about how the building's original design included a protected chamber. It also mentioned that the documents about this chamber were never meant to be made public. The tone was formal and direct, like an official statement. I ran my finger over the text. I felt chills on my arms, but not from the cold. Someone had put this here during the night. I glanced around the quiet room, noticing the hum of the overhead lights. I could hear my own breathing, shallow and uneven. I put the folder under my arm and left the archives. I didn't know who was behind all this, but I had enough proof to show there was something bigger going on. I headed to my office, locked the door, and set the folder down on my desk. I felt a heavy weight on my shoulders. I realized I was scared. My chest felt tight and my mind raced with possibilities. There were no easy answers. I wish I could say I solved the mystery right then and there, but I didn't. I still work here, and the library goes on like it always has. People come in, check out books, do their research, and leave. Most have no idea about the strange messages or the hidden chamber. Edgar and I agreed to keep it quiet for now. We don't want more strange incidents. We don't want city officials breathing down our necks. We just hope we can figure it out on our own terms. But every time I pass by that section in the basement, I feel a spike of anxiety. Every time I see books out of place on the shelves, my heart starts to pound. And I can't help but wonder if there's more waiting for me, hidden somewhere behind the walls or buried in the archives. For now, I'm just keeping watch, waiting to see if the messages start up again. If they do, I'll be ready. I'm sitting at my workstation, staring at the incoming data on my monitors, and my hands won't stop shaking. I can hear the wind pounding against the outer walls, and the metal roof panels rattle every few seconds. There's no one else in this building, and the nearest sign of civilization is a small village about 50 miles down the mountain. Sometimes I think I can sense something watching me from outside. I know that sounds paranoid, but after everything I've seen in the last couple of months, I can't ignore it. I arrived here 7 months ago. I was excited at first. The station is remote, tucked high among rocky slopes with unpredictable weather patterns and sudden temperature drops. My main job is to track atmospheric changes and report the data back to the lab in the city. They assigned me a small cabin next to the main observation tower. It's equipped with a bunk, a tiny bathroom, and a basic kitchen. The tower houses all my weather instruments and computers. A generator in a separate shed supplies electricity. I do scheduled maintenance on the generator once a week. The rest of the time, I monitor the equipment, collect readings, and log observations. It's a solitary routine, but I used to like the silence. Then I started noticing odd spikes in the data. At first, I thought it was a glitch. The anemometer would record sudden wind gusts that didn't match the actual wind speed outside. The barometer showed slight dips and rises when the sky was perfectly clear. My sensors for humidity and temperature reported fluctuations that made no sense. I did a full inspection of the sensors, replaced wiring, recalibrated the software, and even swapped out an old module. Everything was clean. But the strange patterns persisted. I have daily logs of all these anomalies, and when I finally decided to look for a cycle, I noticed something. The readings formed a sequence that matched a repeated pattern every 33 days. The pattern wasn't obvious at first because it appeared in several different data sets: temperature, wind speed, atmospheric pressure, and even the shortwave radiation levels. Each time the numbers lined up in a way that seemed intentional, almost like a code. I tried to ignore the possibility of something out of the ordinary. I told myself that maybe there was an unusual microclimate phenomenon in this region. One night, about 3 months ago, I was outside checking on the generator around midnight. The air felt colder than usual. My skin prickled on my neck and arms. I heard a buzzing sound, like electricity coursing through a loose cable, but I couldn't see any source. Then I spotted a faint glow in the sky above the far ridge, way beyond the summit. It wasn't a typical star or plane. The light flickered, changed color slightly, and then moved in a steady arc. My heart pounded so hard that I felt it in my ears. I stood there for a few minutes staring at it, unsure if I should grab my camera or run inside. I ended up standing still, just watching. Then the glow vanished. I made a note of the exact time and ran back inside. In the morning, I analyzed the data from that night. I saw a peak in the electromagnetic readings that matched the moment I saw the light. I didn't tell my superiors. I felt uneasy and wasn't sure if they'd take me seriously. I decided to wait and see if it would happen again. Sure enough, 33 days later, the same pattern in the instruments repeated. That same night, I saw another light. But this time it was brighter and moved faster. I took pictures with my phone, but the images came out blurry and indistinct. It just looked like a smudge of white in the darkness. Over the last 2 cycles, I've also noticed changes in the local wildlife. I rarely see large animals up here, but occasionally I spot deer or mountain goats in the distance. Lately, they've been acting jittery. They dart across the slopes at unexpected times. Once I found claw marks on the wooden siding of the station, as if some creature had tried to climb it. I hear distant howls at night that don't sound like any normal wolf or coyote. It's more like a short burst of screams, then silence. My nerves feel shredded by the time morning arrives. I don't sleep much anymore. 2 cycles ago, I decided to set up a motion-activated camera about half a mile from the station. It's hidden behind a boulder, pointed at the area where I saw the first glow. I hiked out there in early morning light, my boots sinking into loose gravel. The cold air stung my face. I could hear nothing except for the crunch of my steps and the occasional rustle of wind in the pines. My palms kept sweating inside my gloves. I set up the camera, tested it, and hiked back. For a while, nothing happened, but on the exact 33rd day, I got pictures of moving lights. They appeared as a series of orbs shifting positions over the course of half an hour. The final shots show one of them glowing intensely before the camera lens got overloaded and turned everything white. The next image is black. The camera shut itself off. I found it still in place the following day. The battery was drained. Its internal memory had those last few frames, but nothing else. I haven't shared that footage with anyone. I downloaded it onto a separate hard drive and labeled it as routine sky observations. Sometimes I think about calling someone for backup, but I can't bring myself to do it yet. My contract still has 5 months left, and I don't want to lose my position. If I start spouting wild stories about glowing lights and weird patterns, I might get pulled from the assignment. The isolation is getting to me, but I also feel compelled to figure this out. I keep a close eye on the daily data. Every time the anomalies come around, the pattern intensifies. I also pay attention to my environment. I track any unusual animal behavior. 3 weeks ago, I saw a pack of 4 mountain goats standing on a slope not far from the tower, all of them staring in the same direction. They weren't moving. Their ears were pinned back. Their breathing seemed shallow. Then, as soon as I opened the door to step out, they bolted. I tried to see what they were looking at, but there was nothing obvious. Just rocks and pine trees. A few nights later, I heard scraping sounds outside my cabin. I opened the window, shone my flashlight, and glimpsed something darting behind the water tank. It was too dark to identify. All I saw was a flash of fur. My nights are a mixture of short bursts of sleep and waking up in a sweat. Sometimes I feel the walls vibrate with the wind, or I think I do. My ears ring at odd times. One morning, I woke up with a splitting headache. When I checked the logs, I saw that the barometric pressure had suddenly dipped around 2:15 a.m. I can't prove these are connected, but I feel it in my bones. I started charting the exact times of these anomalies in a notebook. I detailed the electromagnetic spikes, the temperature changes, the wind gusts, and the lights I see in the sky. Every 33 days, the pattern repeats, but each time it's slightly stronger. This leads me to suspect some external force is at play. I don't have advanced equipment to analyze electromagnetic fields beyond a certain point, but I've done what I can with the gear here. The results keep telling me there's a powerful source of something triggering these fluctuations. It's not a glitch in the system. Late last month, I tried climbing to a higher vantage point. I wanted to watch the entire valley the night the lights were due to appear. I packed a small bag with snacks, water, a flashlight, extra batteries, and my camera. I left the station in the early afternoon and hiked until I reached a rocky outcrop that offered a clear view of the sky and the ridges. I set up a small tripod and found a spot behind a large rock formation to shield myself from the wind. The temperature dropped quickly once the sun went down. I could see my breath in front of me, hanging in the air like a cloud. The only sounds were the occasional flap of my jacket and the crunch of gravel when I shifted my weight. Around 1 a.m., I saw a faint glow in the northern sky. My heart started racing, and my mouth went dry. I focused my camera, adjusting the settings so I wouldn't miss anything. Within minutes, the glow turned into a distinct orb, then split into two orbs. They moved slowly at first, almost drifting. Then they picked up speed, zipped across a section of sky, and stopped abruptly. I felt my stomach churn. I snapped picture after picture, but my hands shook so much I had trouble keeping the camera steady. I tried to breathe slowly, but the cold air stung my lungs. The lights merged again, then disappeared. I felt a jolt of fear run through my body. I stayed out there for another hour, but nothing else happened. The next morning, I returned to the station, exhausted and uneasy. I wanted to review the photos right away. Most of them turned out blurry or showed only streaks of light. A few frames captured a pair of bright orbs against a dark sky. They're not conclusive. They just look like strange lights. No detail. I sat in front of my computer, my head in my hands, feeling a dull ache at the base of my skull. All I could do was confirm that the phenomenon isn't imaginary. It's real, but I have no explanation. As the days pass, I get more and more tense. I double-check the locks on the doors at night. I verify that all my windows are secure. The wind keeps me on edge. Every gust that rattles the tower feels like a warning. My shoulders stay tight, and my back aches from hunching over the computer and from the constant stress. I've started sleeping with my boots next to the bed in case I need to run outside. I also keep a flashlight and a sturdy shovel near the front door. I'm approaching another cycle. The next 33-day mark is less than a week away. The animals are acting strange again. Yesterday I heard that same high-pitched howl right after sunset. It echoed off the rocks, making it hard to pinpoint the direction. The hair on my arms stood up, and I felt a chill crawl along my spine. This morning, I found fresh tracks near the generator shed. They looked like hoof prints but spaced in an odd pattern, almost like the animal had been limping or pacing back and forth. I followed them for a while, but they disappeared into a patch of ice and loose scree. My gut felt heavy. I couldn't shake the sense that something out there is waiting. Tonight, the wind is calm, the sky is clear. I'm at my desk, checking the forecast readings. The electromagnetic meter is climbing slowly, just as it always does before the lights show up. The generator hums steadily in the background. My nerves are shot. My stomach is in knots. I keep sipping coffee, but it's not helping. I can't concentrate on anything except the numbers on my screen. I think about calling the lab, but I don't know how to explain all of this in a way that won't sound hysterical. Instead, I keep my radio on in case someone tries to contact me. The static reminds me I'm still connected to the outside world, even if it's distant. My plan is simple. I'll stay awake all night. I'll keep a video camera rolling and I'll record everything that happens. If the lights appear, I'll document them and cross-reference the data in real time. I want undeniable proof that something abnormal is happening up here. I prepared extra memory cards and fully charged all my devices. My hands shake whenever I think about stepping outside in the dark, but I know I have to do it if the lights show up. It's almost midnight now, and the temperature is dropping fast. I can see the numbers on the digital thermometer ticking down. My breath catches in my throat. A creeping tension spreads across my shoulders. I force myself to stretch my arms and rotate my neck, trying to stay loose. My heart thuds against my chest, and sweat prickles my forehead. The tower's interior lights are the only illumination aside from my laptop screen. Outside is pitch black. I open the blinds and look at the stars. They're bright tonight, but they don't comfort me. A few minutes ago, I heard a distant scraping noise, almost like claws on metal. It came from the direction of the generator shed. I paused everything and listened, but it stopped. Now every small creak or pop makes me jump. The tension is suffocating. I've never felt this wound up in my life. My spine feels like it's locked in place and my breathing is shallow. I can't tell if it's the altitude, the cold, or my nerves. The clock on my computer reads 11:57 p.m. 3 minutes until midnight. Then the new day starts, and we're exactly 33 days from the last peak. I can't deny the pattern. My data doesn't lie. I glance at the electromagnetic meter again. The needle is inching higher. I swallow hard, my throat dry. I rub my palms on my pants to wipe off the sweat. My heart pounds like a drum. I reach for the camera, switching it on. The tiny red light glows, and the lens adjusts with a soft whir. I can't predict exactly what will happen, but I know something is about to begin. My body feels it. There's an energy in the air, a thickness that makes it hard to focus. The weather station feels too small, like the walls are closing in. I run my tongue across my lips, trying to summon some moisture. I step toward the window and lift the camera, pointing it at the sky. The wind outside is still, which is unusual for this time of night. I hold my breath and wait. A faint glimmer appears in the distance, a small point of white light dancing along the horizon. My heartbeat jolts. I zoom in. The light flickers, shifts color to a dull orange, and then back to white. My chest tightens, and a knot forms in my stomach. This is it. The cycle is repeating, right on schedule. I tighten my grip on the camera and press the record button. My entire body tingles with adrenaline. I want to keep filming, but I also feel an urge to run outside, to see it without the glass in the way. Part of me is afraid of what I'll find. I take a step toward the door, not sure if it's the right move. The radio crackles in the background, just static. I hesitate, hand on the doorknob. My breath is shallow. I remind myself I need the best evidence possible. I yank the door open and step into the freezing air. My breath condenses in front of my face. The cold immediately presses against my skin. I can feel my heart pounding in my chest and a slight tremor in my legs. I aim the camera at the sky. The light glows stronger now. It's moving in a slow circle. The hair on my arm stands up. My pulse hammers in my ears. I record for several seconds, then shift my angle. The mountains are mostly silhouettes against the sky, but that glow stands out like a beacon. The quiet is overwhelming. There's no wind, no rustling of animals. Just my own breathing. Suddenly, I hear a metallic clang from behind the station near the generator shed. I whip around, shining the camera's light in that direction. My heart feels like it's about to burst from my chest. I don't see anything at first. Then I notice the corner of the shed door is bent slightly outward, like something tried to pry it open. A wave of nausea hits me. I inch closer, keeping the camera up. My hands tremble so badly that the video will probably come out shaky. The metal door looks scratched, and there's fresh scarring on the paint. I step back, scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. My lungs are tight, and I'm shaking from both cold and fear. I don't see anything else. Then I glance at the sky again. The light is gone. The only things up there are normal stars. I spin around, searching, but there's no sign of that glowing orb. My stomach clenches and I feel sweat on my brow despite the cold. I don't know if I'll ever figure out what's behind these patterns or the lights. I just know they're real, and they're happening right above me. The cycle keeps repeating and the animals keep acting strange. This station, once a place of routine, now feels like a trap. I'm tired, my nerves are shot, and my head hurts constantly, but I can't walk away without answers. For now, I'll keep gathering data, keep the cameras rolling, and hope I can stay rational long enough to see this through. I've worked as a night guard at the Briarton Museum for about 6 months now. When I first got the job, I felt pretty lucky. It paid better than my old warehouse gig, and the schedule fit my lifestyle. I never minded working nights, and I figured guarding a museum would be straightforward. Walk around every hour, check the exhibits, make sure no one's sneaking around, and fill out some incident reports if anything goes wrong. I didn't expect to see what I saw last week. I didn't expect to see statues shift position when no one was watching, and I definitely didn't expect to catch them on camera performing some kind of strange, silent ritual. I'm telling you this because it still doesn't feel real, but I know what I saw. There's no doubt in my mind. Every shift, I arrive around 8 at night. I pass through the main lobby, greet the evening staff, and wait for them to leave. By 10, the museum is empty except for me, and on some nights another guard on the second floor. But most nights it's just me. The first time I noticed something strange was about 2 weeks ago. I was doing my normal patrol on the first floor. Our museum has a large collection of marble statues, most of them from the 18th and 19th centuries. They stand in neat rows in a long corridor that leads to the staff offices. Usually, I glance at them for a second or two and move on. But that night, I had a nagging feeling something was off. It wasn't anything huge at first. It was a sculpture of a man wearing Roman-style armor. Normally, he faces straight ahead with a sword resting by his side. But that night, the sword seemed tilted, like he was raising it an inch higher than normal. I stood there for a moment, shining my flashlight on the statue. I told myself maybe I was imagining it. Maybe I never paid close attention to the angle of the sword. So I shrugged and kept walking. The rest of the night was normal, or at least I thought so. But when I did my second round at around midnight, I realized the statue's sword was definitely higher than before. It looked like the statue was starting to lift it. I felt my pulse spike. My flashlight shook in my hand. I took a step closer and ran my fingers along the marble sword hilt. It felt cold and solid, just like any other stone. I tried to see if there were any cracks or signs that someone tampered with it. I didn't see anything. Still, I felt uneasy. I made a note about it in my log. I wrote something like, "Roman soldier statue sword seems out of position," just to document it. Over the next few nights, I noticed more changes. It wasn't just that one statue. The woman holding a vase seemed to turn her head slightly. The man kneeling on a pedestal looked like he rose another inch off the ground. Small changes, but enough to catch my eye. Every time I'd freeze for a second, stare at the statues, and feel a chill in my chest. It was the way they seemed to be coming to life, bit by bit. Nothing big, no large leaps or gestures, but subtle shifts that made no sense. Around that time, I decided to check the security footage for the corridor. Normally, we only review camera feeds if there's a reported incident or if the alarm triggers. But I had a growing curiosity. I stayed late after my shift one morning, asking the day manager if I could watch a few hours of overnight footage. He didn't ask too many questions. He just showed me how to access the files on the computer. I started fast-forwarding through the recordings, expecting to see static statues the whole time. That's not what happened. At first, the footage looked normal. I saw myself walking along the corridor, shining my flashlight on the statues at around 10, then again at midnight, then around 2. Then, when no one was around, I saw something that made my heart pound. The statues started to move, not all at once, and not in big motions. It looked like they were testing their own joints. A tilt of a head here, a shift of a foot there. Then about half of them turned toward one another and formed a semicircle, like they were gathering in the center of the corridor. I remember my hands sweating so much that I almost dropped the mouse. I took a deep breath and kept watching. I felt sick. I didn't have words. I just stared at the screen. The statues moved in short, jerky motions, but they moved. Some lifted their arms, some tilted their heads back, some tapped the marble floor with their stone heels. They never made noise. There was no sound on these cameras anyway, but I imagined the faint scraping of stone against stone. I watched them stand in that semicircle for a while. They moved so slowly that if I blinked, I might miss it. Then they arranged themselves in some sort of formation, their arms stretched toward the ceiling as if they were reaching for something. After a couple of minutes, they returned to their original positions. By the time I came back on camera for my next round, they were motionless. If I hadn't seen the footage, I never would have believed it. They looked like ordinary statues when I walked by. I felt a twist in my stomach, like my body wanted to reject what I was seeing. But it was right there on the screen. I copied that footage onto a USB drive because I wanted some proof of what was happening. I didn't show it to anyone right away. I spent the next day thinking about it, barely sleeping. My mind kept replaying the images of those statues moving on their own. I tried to convince myself it was some glitch, some editing trick, or a problem with the cameras. But I knew the cameras were in good shape, and I'd seen the subtle changes with my own eyes. The following night, I felt more on edge. I tried to do my rounds like usual, but my heart pounded with every step. I kept looking over my shoulder, shining my flashlight at the statues more than normal. I stepped closer to them than I ever had before, checking for hidden joints, hinges, or anything that could explain their movement. I found nothing. Around midnight, I stationed myself near the camera room. I wanted to watch the live feed, see if they moved while I was sitting there. I sat in front of the monitors, scanning each camera. For a while, it was dead still. Then, about an hour later, the feed from the statue corridor flickered slightly. I leaned forward, my eyes locked on the screen. One statue in the corner turned its head just a bit. It was the one of a woman with a robe draped over her left shoulder. She shifted, twisted her torso, then faced the statue next to her. I felt my pulse hammer in my ears. I wanted to get up, but my legs felt heavy. I just stared. Then another statue moved, raising its arm. One by one, they all came to life again, until they were positioned in that same semicircle, arms raised. I couldn't handle sitting still. I jumped up, grabbing my flashlight, and walked quickly toward the corridor. When I reached it, everything was quiet. The statues were in that semicircle, just like on the screen. I kept my distance because I felt a weird kind of panic, like I was trespassing in their space. My breathing was rough, and I felt my hands trembling. The air felt cold against my face, and my ears started buzzing with adrenaline. I shined the flashlight across the group. Their faces looked blank and serious, with no traces of warmth or softness. I'm not sure what I expected them to do, but they stood motionless. After a few seconds, I heard a faint scraping sound. It was coming from behind the largest statue, the one that looked like a knight holding a shield. I moved my flashlight toward it and saw his stone foot slide an inch across the floor. My chest tightened. I took a step back, almost tripping over my own feet. Then he stopped. My flashlight shook as I tried to keep it steady. I couldn't believe it was real. All I could hear was my own breathing, the hum of the museum's ventilation system, and the quiet scrape of marble on marble. I wanted to turn around and run, but I forced myself to stand there a moment longer, trying to make sense of it. The rest of the statues remained in that semicircle. Their arms were raised as if they were locked in mid-motion. The statue behind the knight was hunched forward with a stern expression carved into its face. I saw a faint shift in the angle of its head. Then everything went still again. I realized I was holding my breath, so I exhaled slowly, my heartbeat racing. I backed away, not turning my back on them until I was out of the corridor. Then I almost sprinted to the camera room. I sat in the chair and watched the monitors again. They held their formation for maybe 5 minutes, then, one by one, they returned to their original spots along the corridor. When I went back to check, it was as if nothing had happened. They were all in their usual places, looking completely ordinary. Over the next couple of nights, I tried to figure out a pattern to their behavior. I reviewed more footage. The statues seemed to do this ritual every night around the same time. It lasted roughly half an hour, sometimes a bit more. They formed that circle, raised their arms, and then reversed their movements, ending back in place. Sometimes a few statues would linger, as if they had trouble returning to their original positions. One in particular, a tall figure with outstretched arms, tended to remain facing the opposite direction until the last second. It looked like it was reluctant to go back to being just a statue. I haven't told my supervisor yet. I'm worried no one will believe me. The USB drive with the footage is hidden in my backpack at home. I'm thinking about showing it to a friend of mine who's a tech-savvy guy. Maybe he can confirm there's no editing or trick. I'm still hesitant to go public with this because it sounds ridiculous. Who's going to believe a bunch of statues come alive at night and perform some silent ritual? But I can't deny what I've seen. My body's reaction tells me how real it is. Every night, when I walk those halls, I feel my skin crawl. I sweat more than usual and my hands shake when I pass by that corridor. The adrenaline rush keeps me hyper-aware of every little sound. Sometimes I feel like I hear stones scraping behind me, but when I turn around, there's nothing. Yesterday, I tried to touch one of the statues, just to see if there was any warmth or vibration. It was cold, solid marble, no different from any other stone sculpture. It didn't respond. But that night, on the cameras, I saw that same statue shift its arm more than the others. It lifted it all the way up, almost parallel to its shoulder, then brought it back down. I got the impression it was angry or annoyed. I know that sounds weird, but it seemed like it was protesting my touch. Of course, there was no expression change on its face, but the motion felt deliberate. I haven't seen them do any direct harm. They move in a coordinated way. They gather, they pause, they raise their arms, and then they go back. I wonder if they're communicating or trying to complete some sort of process. I'm no expert on statues or ancient artifacts. I'm just a security guard who took a job to pay my bills. But now I'm in the middle of something that I don't understand. Tonight, I'm planning to set up my phone to record them from a different angle. The museum cameras cover most angles, but I want my own personal footage in case the official recordings vanish or get corrupted. I'm worried about weird coincidences, like maybe the files will get erased somehow. I also thought about hiding behind one of the displays to watch them in person, but that idea makes my skin crawl. I don't know how they would react if they realized I was spying on them up close. My gut tells me not to get too close. Every time I try to approach the corridor when they're moving, I get this overwhelming sense of danger. The hair on my arms stands up, and my instincts scream at me to keep my distance. So I do. I back off and rely on the cameras. Once they finish, I go out to confirm they're back in place. I don't know how long I can keep doing this before something changes. What if they realize I'm onto them? I know how crazy this all sounds. It's hard to talk about. My coworker sometimes covers the second floor, but he doesn't come down to the corridor on the first floor. He just minds his own business up there. I don't think he's noticed anything odd. The second floor exhibits are mostly paintings and fossils, no statues. So for now, this seems to be my personal nightmare. I don't plan to stay at this job much longer. My contract is up in a couple of months, and I'm looking for a way out. But I can't just forget about this. Part of me wants to see what happens if I stay longer, gather more footage, and maybe confront them directly. Another part of me wants to run as far as I can and never come back. I haven't slept well in days. I keep replaying the images of stone figures shifting in the darkness, forming that circle and raising their arms like it's some secret ceremony. My heart races just remembering it. I can't hear any voices or chanting, but I can sense a tension, like there's an energy I can't explain. I notice my body reacting in a primal way, telling me this is a threat. My face gets hot, my shoulders tense, and my breathing turns shallow whenever I think about it. I'm not sure how this will end. For now, I show up, do my rounds, and record what I can. I might talk to a friend in a day or two. Maybe I'll show him the USB. I need someone to back me up because I'm afraid the museum management will laugh me out of the building. Or worse, they'll think I'm messing with the exhibit somehow. But I'm not doing anything except watching. I'm not touching them, other than that one time. And I regret even doing that. So that's what's going on. This museum is not normal. Those statues are not just carved blocks of stone. They move when no one's looking and the cameras don't lie. I've watched them over and over again, and it never gets easier to accept. If you ever find yourself walking past an old statue at night, maybe keep an eye on it. Because what I've seen here has changed the way I look at these silent figures forever. They're not as lifeless as they seem, and I'm proof of that. I just hope I can hold it together until my contract is up. Then I'll leave, and the museum can deal with its living statues on its own. I opened the workshop door on my first day and felt a wave of stale air hit my nose. The smell reminded me of old wood and metal shavings. I remember pausing in the doorway, wondering why the building seemed untouched for so long. My uncle gave me the keys after he moved away, and I only knew it was a clock workshop filled with antique pieces. He never talked about the details. I just knew it was old and had been in our family for a few generations. I expected dust and rust, but not a strange sense of stillness. I switched on the single overhead light near the entrance. Several workbenches lined the walls, and shelves filled with tools took up most of the space in the back. There were wooden cabinets with glass doors, each holding various clock parts like gears, pendulums, and old clock faces. Some clocks hung on the walls, each one frozen at different times. I heard a faint ticking from somewhere in the corner, but I couldn't see which clock was still running. That ticking made me uneasy. It was slow, steady, and seemed to echo. I spent the first day cleaning. I dusted off counters, swept the floor, and tried to organize the tools by size. Around lunchtime, I noticed a grandfather clock by the far wall. It stood about 7 feet tall, with a carved wooden body. The clock face had Roman numerals, and the glass panel showed an intricate pendulum inside. When I checked the time, the hands pointed to 3:33. The pendulum was perfectly still, though. I tapped the glass, but nothing moved. The time stayed stuck. I didn't think much of it at first. Antique clocks often freeze at random times if they haven't been serviced for a while. I went back to work, sorting out little drawers of watch hands and winding keys. By late afternoon, I set up a small cot in the back room to rest in case I stayed overnight. I thought I might do some repairs in the evening and wanted a place to lie down if I got too tired. My first night in that workshop felt normal until around midnight. The place was quiet except for the occasional creak from the floorboards. I ate a quick dinner from a can and sat at one of the workbenches with a small table lamp on. I tried to fix a simple pocket watch with a loose spring. That was when I noticed all the other clocks in the room started ticking at the same time. It was faint, but every clock on the wall seemed to be ticking in unison. I set down the pocket watch and listened. My heart rate sped up, and I felt the hair on my arms stand up. I walked around checking the clocks. Each one showed a random time, and not a single one had a working pendulum. Yet I heard a clear ticking sound from all directions. Then it stopped. The silence returned so fast it felt like a gust of wind had vanished. I rubbed my eyes and tried to convince myself that old clocks can make weird noises when the temperature changes. I decided to call it a night. I turned off the lights and headed to the back room, leaving only a small lamp on by the hallway so I wouldn't trip if I got up in the dark. I tossed and turned on the cot, thinking about that synchronized ticking. I must have dozed off because I woke up later to a strange chill in the air. My phone showed 3:31 a.m. The workshop seemed dead quiet. I got up, grabbed a flashlight, and went to the main area. My footsteps sounded loud on the floor, and I saw the shapes of clocks along the walls in the flashlight beam. At 3:33 exactly, every clock in the workshop chimed in a low, muffled way. I can't explain it well. It wasn't a clear chime like a normal clock. It was more like a collective thud that shook the air. At the same time, the flashlight flickered, and I saw shadows against the walls. They moved in patterns, like people walking or standing, but I couldn't see clear faces. It looked like a group of figures huddled near the workbenches, passing objects to each other. Their movements were jerky and silent, as if I was watching a silent film projected on the walls. My throat went dry. I felt sweat on my forehead and my heart pounding in my chest. I stumbled backward, almost dropping the flashlight. I wanted to call out, but I didn't know what to say. My body froze until the shadows disappeared. It all stopped at 3:34. That's when the workshop returned to normal. The clocks looked as they did before, their hands stuck at various times. The air felt less heavy. I stood there, panting. My flashlight was trembling in my grip. Eventually, I walked back to the cot, sat down, and tried to steady my breathing. I told myself I was tired or dreaming. Maybe I'd imagined the shadows. But the feeling in my gut told me I saw something real. My eyes were open, and the sound of that group chime was too clear to ignore. After a few minutes, I decided to stay awake until morning. I turned on every light in the workshop and drank the cold coffee left over from earlier. My nerves were still shot, and my hands wouldn't stop shaking. By the time the sun rose, I had convinced myself I needed to investigate. The next day, I checked every clock carefully. I tried winding a few, and they responded with odd clicks but never moved their hands. When I set them to the current time and tried to start the pendulums, they'd swing for a couple of seconds and then stop. It was like they were refusing to run. I spent hours cleaning gears, adjusting springs, and oiling the mechanisms. Nothing changed. They all seemed locked in place, stuck on random times. The only consistent detail was that each clock stopped at a different time, except one or two that showed 3:33, but none of them would run for more than a few seconds. That night, I prepared myself. I set up a camera on a tripod aimed at the main area, hoping to catch something on film. I turned off most lights but left a small lamp on for minimal illumination. I wanted to see if the camera would record any movement on the walls. I sat behind the camera, waiting. Midnight passed without incident. My eyes started to droop around 2 a.m., but I forced myself to keep watch. At 3:31, my phone vibrated with a low battery warning. I plugged it into a charger and noticed a sudden drop in temperature. My skin prickled, and I heard the faint ticking start again. At 3:33, the workshop filled with that dull chime. The camera's red recording light stayed on, and I tried to focus on the walls. The shadows appeared again, sliding across the surfaces. I watched them closer this time. They looked like people wearing old-fashioned clothes, but I couldn't see details, just silhouettes. One of them seemed to be opening a toolbox on the bench. Another passed something from a high shelf. They moved with purpose, but there was no sound of tools or voices. I felt my pulse quicken. My breath came in short bursts. I worried the camera might not capture them, or maybe it would. I couldn't decide which possibility scared me more. The shadows continued their actions for about a minute. Then they vanished at 3:34. Everything went quiet again. I immediately stopped the camera and played back the footage. My hands shook as I skipped to the 3:33 mark. Nothing. No shadows, no movement. Just the workshop with me sitting there, staring. I saw myself tense up, shining the flashlight around. But on the recording, the walls were empty. It looked like I was panicking for no reason. I shook my head and replayed it again, but the result was the same. I began to doubt my own senses. I decided to stay a few more nights, repeating the experiment. Every single time 3:33 hit, the clocks gave off that dull chime and shadows flickered over the walls. I smelled old oil and heard faint rustling movements that didn't match anything visible in the actual workshop. At 3:34, it always ended, but the camera never captured a single shadow. My phone didn't record anything unusual either. My attempts to fix the clocks kept failing. None would hold time properly. I replaced gears, adjusted clock hands, and reattached pendulums. Still, they froze or stopped ticking within seconds. Late in the afternoon on the fourth day, I decided to gather all the clocks in one corner to keep a closer watch. I placed them side by side in a neat arrangement. Some were small desk clocks, some were large wall clocks, and there was that tall grandfather clock. They still showed random times with a few stuck at 3:33. That evening I set up more lights so I could see every inch of the walls. I taped down thick black paper in one corner, thinking maybe the shadows would show up more clearly against a uniform background. I spread out a few motion sensors on the floor too. I wanted to see if they would detect any movement. At around 1 a.m., I tested them by walking around. The sensors beeped when I passed by, so I knew they worked. Then I sat down and waited. I felt my stomach knot as 3:33 approached. My palms were sweaty, and I had trouble sitting still. At 3:32, I heard the ticking begin. I checked the motion sensors. They stayed quiet. Then 3:33 arrived, and the dull chime echoed around me. The sensors made no sound, but I saw the shadows on the wall again. This time they seemed to be hammering something on a table. I heard a faint banging, so I knew it wasn't just a vision. My heart pounded so hard I could feel my pulse in my neck. I looked over at the motion sensors. They still showed no movement. I shone a flashlight on the wall. The shadows didn't react. They kept working or miming whatever they were doing. They passed each other objects that looked like gears or tools. I wanted to move closer, but my legs felt weak. I stayed put, holding my breath. At 3:34, they disappeared. The workshop fell silent again, and the tension in my body released in a wave. I exhaled hard and checked the sensors. Nothing had changed on their displays. Over the next few days, I tried different ways to document what happened at 3:33. I used thermal imaging, extra cameras, and even an old tape recorder I found in a drawer. Nothing picked up the shadows. My voice recorder only caught my own breathing and some faint clicks. The more I tried, the more frustrated I got. The shadows kept appearing at the same minute, then vanished at 3:34. Every clock in that room refused to move beyond that frozen time. I began to dread going to sleep. I started staying up all night watching the walls at the exact moment. Each time the scene looked similar, dark silhouettes doing tasks from a bygone era. Their clothing looked like something from the early 1900s, but I couldn't see faces or hear their voices. I only caught hints of rustling fabric or a slight clank of metal. I felt like I was stuck in some twisted loop. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't break through to their world or pull them into mine. They just did their routine, then disappeared. I also noticed a buildup of stress in my own body. My shoulders ached from constant tension, and I had trouble eating. I was always on edge. Even during the day, I checked every corner of the workshop, half expecting to see a flicker of those shadows. But they only came at 3:33. They always ended at 3:34. One afternoon, I decided to focus on that tall grandfather clock specifically. I disassembled it on the main workbench, laying out each gear, spring, and screw. I cleaned every piece and oiled them carefully. I tested the clock outside, in the open workshop air, to see if humidity was an issue. It didn't matter. The clock remained stubborn. When I reassembled it and tried to set the correct time, it froze again at 3:33. I wiped sweat off my brow and checked my watch. It showed 2:15 in the afternoon, so I knew it wasn't actually 3:33. Yet the grandfather clock's hand stayed there, locked in place. I lost track of the number of nights I stayed. Maybe a week, maybe more. Each night brought the same event. Each day I felt more exhausted. My eyes were bloodshot, and my hands shook even when I wasn't thinking about the shadows. I started to get paranoid. I jumped at small noises like the clang of a dropped screw or the squeak of the workshop door. I felt like the place was watching me. I had no proof, but that's how it felt. On my last night there, I decided I'd had enough. I wanted to pack up and leave, but I also felt a need to stay until I found a solution. At 3:33, the chime rattled my nerves one more time. The shadows appeared in the same spots. They moved a bit quicker, like they were finishing a project. I swallowed hard and forced myself to move closer to the wall. My legs shook. My heart pounded. I reached out a hand, trying to touch the silhouette that seemed to hold a wrench. My hand met the cold plaster of the wall. The shadow's arm passed right through my hand, ignoring me. I felt a chill run down my spine. My heart thudded so hard it hurt my chest. I wanted to shout, but my throat felt tight. I just stared, my eyes wide, my breathing shallow. At 3:34, they vanished once again. The workshop returned to stillness. My flashlight caught the clock faces around me, all stuck at various times. A wave of nausea hit me, and I doubled over, breathing heavily. I realized I had no way to stop this. I had no evidence. Those shadows existed, but only to my senses. No camera or sensor confirmed it. I spent the rest of the night packing a small bag. I left most of the tools and clocks where they were. My hands were unsteady, and my vision kept blurring from lack of sleep. The smell of dust and old grease made me feel sick. When morning came, I walked out of that workshop. I locked the door and stood outside, staring at the old sign above the entrance. I felt my shoulders sag. My eyes stung from fatigue. I looked around the empty street, took a few deep breaths, and decided I needed to step away for a while. I don't know if the clocks still do that routine every night. Maybe I'll come back one day to figure it out. But for now, all I have are those memories of the dull chime at 3:33, the shadows that moved on the walls, and the silence that followed at 3:34. That's all I can handle. I remember the moment I first stepped inside that old church. My heart was pounding, and my legs felt unsteady. The front doors were swollen from moisture, and I had to push hard to make them budge. They creaked so loud that my ears started ringing. I could smell mold and dust as soon as I walked in, and the dim light coming through the stained glass windows barely lit up the place. I wasn't sure if the darkness made the space look bigger or smaller, but I felt a strange tension in my stomach. I'd done restoration work before, but something about this job felt off right away. My name's Ray, and I've been an architect for 15 years. I usually love a good challenge, especially when it involves old religious buildings. They have a certain presence that you don't find in new constructions. But this church felt different. My first task was to do a simple survey, measure the walls, check structural damage, figure out how much I'd have to fix. I had a small flashlight in one hand and my notebook in the other. The floor was covered in debris, broken roof tiles, old scraps of fabric that might have been part of the pews, and random trash left behind by whoever wandered in over the years. I started in the main hall, trying to gauge the scale. I walked along the walls, holding my tape measure, pressing it against the edges. The walls were uneven and some parts looked like they had shifted. In older buildings, that's pretty standard. Foundations settle, wood beams warp, and you can see irregularities all over. But here, the measurements didn't add up. One side would measure 10 feet, and the other side would measure 12. I measured again, and got a different number. I rubbed my eyes, thinking maybe I was too tired, but the numbers kept changing. I felt a surge of confusion, and my hands got sweaty. I told myself I'd come back to that later. By mid-afternoon, I walked toward the back of the church. The hallway there led to a storage room, at least that's what the original plans showed. I tried the door. It was jammed, but after pushing it a bit, I managed to get it open. The inside looked bigger than I expected. My flashlight beam traveled across the floor, and I saw another door at the far end. I didn't remember seeing that door on the blueprint. I moved closer, stepping over piles of dusty cloth and rotten wood. The smell was stale, like wet carpet. My eyes stung from the dust in the air. When I reached that far door, I felt a slight draft. It was cold, and it made the hair on my arms stand up. I opened the door, expecting maybe a closet, but instead there was a narrow corridor that seemed to stretch for a long distance. I pointed my flashlight, but the light got lost in the darkness. I felt a tension in my chest because the building wasn't supposed to have a corridor that long. I had the original layout in my bag, and that corridor wasn't marked. I took a step inside, feeling the floorboards creak beneath my boots. The corridor smelled damp, like old concrete in a flooded basement. I walked a few steps and then stopped, feeling uneasy. The corridor seemed to go on, and I couldn't see any windows or doors on either side. My flashlight wasn't strong enough to illuminate the end, and the darkness felt thicker than normal. My pulse quickened, and I noticed the back of my neck was getting hot. I backed out of there, deciding to check it in daylight. I thought maybe I'd gotten turned around, that maybe the corridor led to an extension of the church, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong with that layout. I closed the door carefully and left. That evening, I set up a small station in the main hall. I had a folding table with my laptop, a few portable LED lamps, and my measuring gear. I planned to spend a few nights there because the client wanted a quick turnaround. The sun started going down around 7. The stained glass windows turned dark and the interior felt colder. I switched on the lamps, but the light didn't travel far. It felt like the shadows swallowed the edges of the room. While I reviewed my notes, I heard a low scraping sound behind me. It was faint, like wood sliding against wood. I spun around, shining a flashlight in the direction of the noise. I saw a door on the far wall that I hadn't noticed before. I felt a jolt of adrenaline. I could have sworn there hadn't been a door there a few hours earlier. I stood up, walked over, and touched the door's surface. The wood looked old, but the hinges appeared clean, like they'd been maintained. My breathing got shallow, and my fingers trembled a bit on the knob. I opened it, and a rush of stale air hit my face. I saw another corridor, narrower than the first one I'd found, leading off to the right. The ceiling was lower, and I could see cobwebs in the corner. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I stepped inside carefully. The walls were made of stone, and the air felt damp. The corridor turned sharply after about 20 feet. I followed it, feeling my gut twist with each step. I told myself I was just doing my job, that I needed to understand the building's layout, but every nerve in my body was on edge. Around the corner, I found a dead end with a small door on the left wall. It was locked. I tried pushing it, but it wouldn't budge. Then I noticed some strange carvings near the handle. They looked like small diagonal lines etched into the stone. I touched them, feeling the rough texture. It didn't seem like anything special, so I turned back. By the time I got back to the main hall, my head was aching and my stomach felt uneasy, like I'd been holding my breath for too long. I realized it was close to midnight. I could see the sky through the broken roof in the back, and the moonlight created odd shapes on the floor. I decided to lock up and sleep. I had a small cot set up against one wall. I draped a tarp over it because the roof in that section leaked a bit. I laid down, but every time I closed my eyes, I heard faint noises, small thuds, scraping, or sometimes a distant echo that sounded like footsteps. My chest felt tight. I kept opening my eyes, pointing the flashlight around, but I never caught anything moving. Eventually, I drifted off for a couple of hours. The next morning, I woke up stiff and sore. My neck hurt from the awkward sleeping position. Sunlight was shining through the stained glass, creating scattered patches of color on the dust-covered floor. I sat up, wiped my face, and tried to remember if I had dreamed about the corridors. My mind felt foggy. I decided to do another set of measurements while the sun was up. Maybe I could confirm if the floor plan had changed or if I'd just made mistakes. I spent the morning going from room to room with my tape measure, marking down the lengths in my notebook. At first, everything seemed normal. The main hall was still about the same size, but the far corners measured differently than the day before. I got a sudden chill in my shoulders. I walked back to that door leading to the corridor I'd discovered the previous afternoon. It was gone. The wall was solid. I ran my hand over the surface, knocking on the wood, thinking maybe the door had been sealed, but it was smooth. No seams, no handle, no sign there had ever been a door. I felt my stomach turn, and I noticed my palms were damp with sweat. I tried to keep calm. I told myself buildings can have illusions or hidden entrances, especially when they're old and damaged. Maybe some shift in the foundation had caused a panel to seal shut, but I couldn't explain how it looked so perfectly seamless. I felt a tremor in my fingers as I put my measuring tape away. My brain told me to get more coffee and try to think this through logically, but my gut was screaming that something was deeply wrong. I spent the rest of the day trying to map out every room again. The corridor in the back still existed, but it didn't extend nearly as far as it had the day before. I didn't see the second corridor at all. I found the same storage room, but it was a normal size this time. I wondered if I should call the client and explain that I needed more time, but I was worried they'd think I was incompetent or losing my mind. I decided to keep it to myself until I had concrete evidence. As evening approached, I set up my lights again. I placed a camera on a tripod in the main hall, facing the back wall. I wanted to see if anything changed on its own. I also had a small voice recorder running. I wasn't sure if it would capture anything, but I needed proof of what I was seeing. Darkness fell quickly. The temperature dropped, and a damp chill settled in the air. My breath felt heavier. My shoulders tensed, and I kept looking over my shoulder. Around 8 p.m., I heard a clicking sound from the far side of the hall. I looked over and saw a door swinging open. I walked toward it, my flashlight shaking in my hand. The door led to a corridor going off at a steep angle. This corridor didn't exist during the day. I glanced at the camera on the tripod, noticing it was pointing in the other direction. I cursed under my breath because I hadn't aimed it where the change occurred. My mind raced, but I pushed forward, determined to document everything. I moved into the corridor. It felt cramped, and the walls seemed to press in on me. My flashlight beam flickered, and I tapped it, hoping the battery wasn't dying. The corridor turned twice, each time revealing another stretch of hallway. The floorboards groaned. I could smell damp stone and old wood. The hair on my arms was standing up again. At the end, I reached a heavy door with iron handles. I pulled on one handle and it creaked open. The door led into a small chamber with no windows. I stepped inside, sweeping the flashlight across the walls. The chamber was about 15 feet square. The walls had dark stains that might have been water damage. I saw a small table in one corner, covered in dust. An old lantern sat on top of it, with a cobweb stretching from the handle to the wall. I reached out and touched the lantern. It was cold and rusted, but it moved when I nudged it. Behind the lantern, I noticed a narrow opening in the stone. It looked like the start of a stairway going down. I felt my throat tighten and a wave of anxiety washed over me. My instincts told me not to go any further, but curiosity won out. I approached the opening. The steps descended into darkness. The air coming up from below felt colder, and I could hear a faint dripping sound. My flashlight barely penetrated the gloom. I hesitated, wondering if I should go back and get my camera or call for help. But I took a step onto the stairs, and my foot slipped on the slick surface. I grabbed the wall to steady myself, and my fingers touched a slime-like growth on the stone. I jerked my hand back, feeling nauseated. I forced myself down a few more steps. The dripping sound grew louder, echoing in the tight space. My heart hammered in my chest and sweat trickled down my back. After maybe 10 steps, I reached a landing. The flashlight revealed a low ceiling and a passageway to the left. I heard a sudden thud from somewhere deep in the darkness. My mind went blank for a moment. My body tensed so hard that my shoulders ached. Every instinct told me to leave, so I turned around and hurried back up the stairs. I felt short of breath, almost panicked. The sense of being watched was overwhelming. When I got back to the chamber, I pulled the door shut behind me. It closed with a bang that echoed in the small room. Then I jogged down the corridors until I reached the main hall. My eyes darted around, checking if anything else had changed. I ran to my camera and stopped the recording. My hands shook as I fiddled with the buttons. Then I realized something. The corridor I'd just come out of looked different. The angle was sharper, and the door that had opened on its own was missing. I felt like I was trapped in a nightmare. I rushed over to where the door had been, but there was only a blank wall. I pressed my palm against it, feeling the cold stone. I knocked on it, and it felt solid. My breathing was ragged, and I could hear my pulse pounding in my ears. I glanced at my watch. It was almost midnight again. I decided to pack up my gear and get out for the night. I collected my lamps, grabbed my notebook, and stuffed them all into my bag. My movements were hurried, and my fingers fumbled. I kept expecting something to appear behind me, or a corridor to open up again. Before I left, I turned off all the lights except my flashlight. The church sank into darkness, and I felt a final wave of dread. I pulled open the heavy front doors, stepped outside, and shut them tight. The cool night air felt like a relief on my skin. My shoulders dropped slightly, and I allowed myself a shaky breath. I got in my car and locked the doors. I stared at the church's silhouette against the moonlit sky. The tall spire looked crooked from this angle. My head was buzzing with questions, but I was too unnerved to think clearly. I knew I'd have to come back the next day, but the idea filled me with a heavy sense of unease. My eyes locked onto the stained glass windows, and I thought I saw a faint flicker inside, like a shadow moving. I swallowed hard and started the engine. I drove away, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tight that my knuckles turned white. I didn't look back again. My heart thumped, and my skin felt clammy. I just wanted to get home and try to process everything. I wished I could blame the strangeness on fatigue or some architectural oddity, but I knew something wasn't right in that place. The walls changed size, corridors vanished, doors appeared where there were none, and something deep below the church was waiting. I could still feel the damp chill on my skin. I could still smell the mold in my nose. Nothing made sense anymore, and the thought of going back made my stomach churn. But I had a job to do, and I had no idea how to handle it without losing my mind. I still remember the first time I heard the reversed recording. It happened late on a Tuesday night when I was alone in my lab, surrounded by a stack of audio equipment and a table full of half-eaten energy bars. I was looking for subtle shifts in sound waves, testing different frequencies to see how they interacted with random background noise. My eyes burned from staring at the waveform monitor all day, and my neck felt tight from leaning over the console. But I couldn't walk away. I was too close to something I couldn't explain. I'd been experimenting with high-frequency pulses for a few weeks. I used a custom oscillator and a complex filter chain. I'd record everything, then analyze the playbacks for unusual patterns. I wasn't chasing ghosts or anything paranormal. I was just looking for anomalies that might hint at new ways to transmit data. My funding came from a small private grant, so I could explore these ideas without a bunch of red tape. I had some freedom, and I was excited to see where it all led. One night, though, I noticed small clicks in my recordings. They weren't mechanical. They didn't line up with the lab's AC hum or any obvious interference. I checked all the cables and made sure there were no loose connections. I isolated the equipment from any external noise. Still, those clicks remained. They almost sounded like faint pops of static, but I felt there was something else beneath them. They had a weird rhythm, almost like a code. I sat at my desk, headphones on, replaying the files over and over. My ears hurt from the constant pressure. The lab was silent except for the buzz of fluorescent lights and the hum of my computer fans. Outside my window, the campus security lights glowed across the empty parking lot. I got up and stretched my back, then decided to reverse one of the audio files on a whim. I wasn't expecting anything. Usually, reversing audio is just a curiosity. But I pressed play, and that's when I heard it. A voice. It was a whisper, almost drowned out by the natural hiss of the recording. I stared at the waveform on my screen. I felt goosebumps on my arms. My heartbeat sped up. The voice didn't make complete sense at first, but it sounded like a distorted phrase in response to what I had said earlier. I remembered I was speaking to myself while recording, saying something like, "I need to check the bass line again." And in the reverse track, there was a faint mumble that matched the same rhythm of my speech. I replayed it at different speeds and tried filtering out the low-end rumble. With some manual tweaking, the voice came through more clearly. It seemed to say, "Check. Again." I took off my headphones and rubbed my eyes. My mouth felt dry, and my hands were shaking. There was no one else in the building. There was no radio or phone near my equipment. I tried not to let my mind spiral, so I reminded myself that sometimes we hear patterns in random noise. But the next night, I repeated the process. I recorded myself asking simple questions to the empty lab. I let the tape run for an hour. I walked around, tested some frequencies, and made idle chatter into the mic. Then I reversed the playback. This time I heard the voice again, and it sounded more distinct. It answered my question about how I should adjust the frequency. Lower. I listened about 100 times, my stomach twisting in knots. The word lower was faint, warbly, and slow, but it was there, synced in the exact spot where I'd asked, "Should I go higher or lower?" I wrote everything down in a notebook. I scribbled timestamps, bits of words I thought I heard, and potential settings for my frequencies. I felt a knot in my throat. I didn't believe in ghosts or spirits, but I couldn't ignore this. The voice seemed to respond to me in real time. But how? I told myself it might be some weird feedback loop that only becomes audible in reverse. Maybe the bouncing signal in the lab's wiring was creating illusions, but part of me sensed that wasn't the case. The following week, I stayed in that lab every evening, often until past midnight. My colleagues were used to me working odd hours, so I didn't raise any suspicions. I told a few of them I was getting interesting data, but I never mentioned the reversed voices. I wanted to verify this phenomenon without sounding like I'd lost my mind. Each night I recorded my tests, and each time I reversed the playback. Each time I heard more phrases. They were never loud or direct. They were always hidden under static and noise, as if the voice lived in the negative space of my recordings. I started to ask direct questions. "What is your name?" No answer. "Where are you from?" No answer. But when I asked, "Is anyone there?" I got a soft whisper that sounded like yes. I got the chills. The hair on my neck stood up. My hand shook so badly that I spilled my coffee on the console. I cursed under my breath and jumped up to grab paper towels. Then I returned to my seat and replayed that segment until my ears rang. It was real, or at least it felt real to me. Sometimes I'd sit at the console with a creeping sense of unease. The lab, which once felt like my second home, became a place that made my skin crawl. I'd hear the air conditioner click on, and I'd startle. My heart would pound whenever the lights flickered. I began to keep the overhead lights at full brightness, even if it gave me a headache. I caught myself looking over my shoulder, checking corners of the room even though I knew no one was there. At one point, I left the mic recording while I stepped out to get some fresh air. My nerves were on edge, and I needed a break. The hallway outside was empty and all the doors were locked. I did a quick check of the floor to confirm I was alone. When I came back, I reversed the file and scanned it for any anomalies. I almost dropped my headphones when I heard a garbled phrase that sounded like, "Don't leave." It was faint, but I recognized the rhythmic pattern. It matched a moment on the timeline where I had spoken earlier about stepping out. I felt this deep sense of dread in my stomach. I actually whispered, "I'm sorry," to the empty room before I even realized what I was doing. I decided to refine my process. I started labeling each audio session with a date and a control frequency. I set up a more precise set of wave analyzers to see if there was any identifiable signature to these reversed voices. I wanted a scientific explanation. Maybe I was producing a phenomenon with standing waves and reflection patterns in the walls. If that was the case, it should show up in the frequency analysis. But each time I got random noise that didn't align with a normal reflection or interference pattern. One night, I tried something different. I set up 2 microphones, one inside the lab and one in the hallway. Then I ran the same sequence of questions while letting both mics record. Afterward, I reversed both files. The voice was on the lab mic, but not on the hallway mic. That sent a rush of cold fear through my body because it meant the voice was local to the lab. It wasn't coming from outside or from the building's ambient noise. I started sleeping in my office. My apartment felt too quiet, and I wanted to keep working through the night. I had a cot in the corner of my office, and I'd sometimes wake up in the dark, the hum of the lab equipment echoing from the next room. I'd lie there, sweat coating my forehead, thinking about the next experiment. I kept imagining that voice showing up while I was asleep, but I never let myself record while I slept. Something about that idea was too unsettling. After another week of intense sessions, I noticed the voice seemed to get clearer as I increased certain high-frequency modulations. It wasn't louder exactly, but it sounded more defined. It started forming short, clear words like, "yes," "no," "wait," or "stop." I got the impression it didn't like some of my frequencies. One night I cranked the oscillator too high, and when I reversed the recording, I thought I heard the voice say, "It hurts." That hit me like a punch in the gut. I felt my heart racing, and I had to step away from the console. My shirt stuck to my back from sweat. My mouth tasted sour and my head pounded. I tried to reason with myself. Maybe I was projecting my own words into the static, but the timing lined up so perfectly. I would say something like, "I'm increasing the frequency," and then in reverse, I'd hear a short, warped phrase right after I spoke, as if it was responding. It was too consistent to ignore. I realized I was struggling to keep my calm. Every night the tension in the lab grew. The thought of hearing that voice again filled me with a weird mixture of anticipation and dread. Eventually, I decided to speak directly to it. I set up my gear for a controlled test. I picked a frequency range that seemed to yield the clearest results and let the tape run. I said, "I know you're in here. Are you with me right now?" Then I waited a minute in silence. I asked a few more questions. "Why can you only speak when I play this backward? Can you hear me right now?" After about an hour, I stopped the recording and reversed it. At first, all I heard was the usual hiss, then a few quiet pops. Then I heard a breathy sound that might have been a word. I replayed it, adjusting filters, straining to hear each syllable. It sounded like, "Here, you." My eyes stung, and I blinked hard. My breathing got shallow. My fingertips went numb. I sat back in my chair, trying to keep my composure. I spoke into the microphone without recording, just talking out loud. I said, "What the hell are you?" No response, obviously. That's not how it worked. The voice only manifested on the reversed playback. The next night, I tested again. This time I asked it directly if it was aware of me in real time. Then I reversed the tape and listened. I thought I heard it say, "yes," followed by some muffled sounds I couldn't decipher. It was like there was more to the message, but it was drowned out in static. My scalp tingled and my chest felt tight. I started pacing the room, mumbling to myself, trying to make sense of everything. I also noticed that the voice never gave me detailed explanations or long sentences. It was always short, direct, and somewhat cryptic. It rarely used more than a few words at a time, but it did seem to recognize some kind of boundary. Whenever I tried to push the frequency range too far, I'd get nothing but bursts of static. Whenever I stayed in the sweet spot, I'd get those faint responses. As the days went by, I found myself talking to it every night, just to see if it would respond. I tried to keep my composure, but I was running on very little sleep. My eyes were bloodshot, and I had dark circles under them. My hands trembled from too much caffeine. My back ached from sleeping on that old cot. But I felt compelled to keep going. Sometimes I caught my own reflection in the lab window and barely recognized myself. I was jumpy and paranoid. The slightest sound made me clench my jaw. I didn't involve any other person in the lab because I was afraid they'd think I was insane. This wasn't the sort of thing I could easily explain, so I kept it to myself. I reviewed the data, tried to find a rational explanation, but I kept hitting a wall. The voice appeared to communicate directly with me through reversed audio. I couldn't dismiss the evidence, yet I couldn't share it without risking my reputation. One night, after a long session, I decided to ask it one more thing. I asked, "What do you want me to do?" I waited, then reversed the file. I heard a soft, drawn-out whisper that sounded like "stop." My chest tightened. My hand went cold against the metal console. I felt that small request flow over me like an actual presence in the room. I sat there, breathing hard, staring at the waveform on my screen, with sweat beading on my forehead. I listened to that "stop" at least 50 times. It was the clearest single word I'd ever captured. It was a direct command, like it knew exactly what I was asking. I leaned back in my chair and felt a wave of fatigue wash over me. I was exhausted, both mentally and physically. My hands shook and my mind raced with possibilities. Why was it telling me to stop? I looked at all my equipment, the cables, the recorders, the computers. I thought about how many nights I'd spent chasing this mystery. My heart pounded, and my breath came in short bursts. Part of me wanted to shut everything down and walk out. Part of me wanted to keep pushing, but I was afraid of what I might discover. I realized I was more scared of continuing than I was of quitting. I reached for the power switch on my console and I stared at it for a long moment. My reflection in the glossy surface showed a tired face, eyes wide with tension. My skin felt cold and clammy. My head pounded. I could almost hear my own blood rushing in my ears. Then I flicked the switch and let the hum of the machines die out. The silence in the lab was overwhelming. I sat there in the darkness, with only the emergency exit light glowing in the corner. I felt my heart slowing down and I took a shaky breath. I packed up some of my notes. I shut down the rest of the equipment, one piece at a time, making sure I labeled everything carefully. My hands trembled as I locked the drawers. I looked at the console for a final moment, remembering all the nights I'd spent capturing those reversed voices. Then I walked out of the lab, leaving it dark and quiet. On the ride home, I kept thinking about that single word: stop. My mind was stuck on the idea that maybe I'd gone too far. Maybe I'd opened a door that shouldn't have been opened. I felt relief, though, because I finally made a decision to walk away, at least for now. The next day, I emailed my colleagues, told them I needed some personal time, and stepped back from the project. I never mentioned the voices. I just said I'd hit a wall with my experiments. For weeks, I avoided any new recordings. I wouldn't even play back the old files. I kept everything stored on a separate drive, locked in my desk. Every once in a while, I'd dream about reversing an audio track and hearing someone whisper my name. I'd wake up sweating, feeling my heart pounding, checking my surroundings to make sure I was alone. But over time, the fear started to fade. replaced by a cautious sense of curiosity. I still have all the original data, the tapes, the digital recordings, the logs of every question and answer. Sometimes I think about going back in there, setting up the equipment again and asking more questions, but every time I get close to doing it, I hear that one word in my head: stop. So far I've listened. I don't know if that's the right choice, but it's the one I've made. And that's the entire story of how I began picking up voices in my reversed recordings and why I decided not to push any further. It still makes my skin crawl, but that's exactly what happened. And I'm not eager to relive it anytime soon. I never believed anything strange could happen in a dull place like this. I clean floors, fix light fixtures, and tighten leaky faucets all day. That's my job. I'm just the janitor here at the Crestfield building, an old apartment complex in the middle of the city. Most people pass by without giving it a second look. It's tall, worn out, and looks like it's hiding a few secrets, but I never cared. At least, I didn't care until I found out what I could hear through the walls. I discovered it on a Wednesday night around 8. The hallways were quiet because everyone was in their apartments. I had a few tasks left: sweep the stairwell, check the boiler room, and make sure the trash was taken out. I was on the 5th floor, next to apartment 5C, when I heard a noise like muffled voices coming through the wall. I thought it was someone arguing inside 5C, so I moved closer. I pressed my ear to the wall. I felt the rough paint against my skin. It smelled a little like mold and old plaster. I expected to hear some random conversation, maybe the TV. Instead, I heard two voices I didn't recognize, and they sounded odd. Their tone was old-fashioned, like an old radio drama. I strained to understand them. My heart pounded in my chest and my palms started sweating. It felt like I was eavesdropping on something that shouldn't exist. I stepped back fast. My foot bumped against my broom, and I almost lost my balance. I looked around the hall. Everything was quiet. The single overhead light flickered a bit. The cream-colored walls looked the same as always, but I couldn't shake off the feeling that I had just listened to something impossible. I pressed my ear to the wall again and waited. There was nothing. I decided I must have been tired or maybe imagining things. I finished my tasks, left the building at 9, and tried not to think about it for the rest of the night. The next morning I came in around 7. I always do a quick walkthrough to see if anything needs urgent attention. The building has 6 floors, plus the basement. I started on the 1st floor, turning on lights and checking that the exit signs were working. When I reached the 5th floor hallway, I noticed the paint near apartment 5C looked different. It was slightly darker, like it had aged overnight. The rest of the wall still had that fresher coat, but this one part seemed older, cracked almost like it belonged in another decade. I touched it with my fingertips. It felt rough, kind of chalky. I couldn't figure it out. I even thought maybe the building's maintenance history was a mess and the patch job was done years ago, but I knew the entire 5th floor had been painted just 5 months earlier. I had been the one holding the paint roller. I couldn't stop staring at the small patch of paint. It was about the size of a dinner plate, maybe bigger. There was this strange line between the new paint and the old paint that just shouldn't be there. I felt my throat tighten. I moved on. I had a lot to do and I didn't want to get stuck on weird stuff. But that night, around 8 again, I was back on the 5th floor to check a flickering light bulb. As I replaced the bulb, I heard the voices again. This time they were more distinct. It sounded like an argument. I put down the new bulb and got on my knees, pressing my ear right against the wall. I heard a man shouting about money. He mentioned a name, someone named Reynolds. He said, "Reynolds won't find out if we keep our mouths shut." Then I heard another voice, deeper and calmer, saying, "We already took the bribe. Just hide the documents." The language was direct, with no sign of modern slang, and it echoed in a weird way. I couldn't place the era, but it felt old. I felt my chest tighten. My mouth went dry. I pulled away, breathing hard. The hallway light seemed a little dimmer, like the building itself was reacting. I grabbed my toolbox and left the floor. I felt shaky all over. In my mind, I kept replaying the conversation. Who were these people? Were they tenants? Was this something that happened years ago and somehow I was hearing it now? It didn't make sense. The next morning, the paint patch had grown. It stretched from the floor to the ceiling in a thick vertical strip. It looked like the original plaster from decades ago, with a layer of old wallpaper showing beneath the chipped paint. I ran my hand over it. Some of the wallpaper flaked off at my touch. Underneath, I could see a swirl pattern that matched a style from maybe the 1930s or 1940s. The rest of the hallway was normal, but this one section kept changing. It made me uneasy. My stomach churned. I decided not to report it to the management. They never listened to me anyway. They'd probably blame me for messing up the wall. Instead, I tried to figure it out on my own. I spent a few hours reading old maintenance logs in the basement. I found that the building was constructed in 1927 and had gone through multiple owners. There was a mention of some legal dispute in the 1950s involving forged documents. I saw the name Reynolds scribbled in the margin of an old file. It sent a shiver down my spine because that was the name I heard through the wall. That night, I waited in the 5th floor hallway. I turned off the overhead light so I'd be harder to see. I pressed my ear to the patch of old wallpaper and held my breath. At first I heard a faint buzzing, like static, then a voice. "I told you we could get in trouble." It was the same man as before, complaining in a hushed tone. Another man responded, "We already took the bribe, there's no turning back." I heard shuffling like papers being stacked or hidden. My body trembled. My heart hammered against my chest and my face felt hot. I glanced around the empty hallway, feeling a rush of cold sweat down my back. I couldn't deny it anymore. I was listening to people from decades ago. When I stood up, I noticed more changes. The hallway light fixture looked older. It used to be a modern LED dome, but now it was a dull metal sconce with a bare bulb. The floors were also different. Instead of the usual worn-out linoleum, I saw scuffed wood boards. I bent down and touched one. It felt solid, real. The entire hallway had shifted into this older version of itself. I could smell old wood polish. My chest felt tight. My breath came in shallow gasps. I walked a few steps down the hall, listening to my own footsteps echo on the hardwood. My nerves were on edge. I wanted to get out of there, but I also felt drawn to it. I forced myself to walk to the elevator. The elevator doors, which were usually a dull silver color, had turned into a dark, cage-like gate. I pushed the call button. I heard mechanical clanking behind the walls, heavier and louder than usual. When the elevator arrived, I saw old-fashioned controls. The capacity sign read, half the usual limit. Everything smelled of grease and stale air. My legs were shaking, but I stepped in. I pressed the button for the lobby. The elevator lurched downward slowly. By the time I reached the first floor, the normal modern doors were back, and the hallway looked like it always did. I stumbled out and pressed my back against the wall, trying to calm down. My heart was thudding so hard it was painful. I didn't understand how the building could physically change. It wasn't just an illusion. I felt those wooden floors. I smelled the old polish. It was real. After a few minutes, I managed to pull myself together. I finished my shift and headed home, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. The next day, things escalated. I was on the 6th floor to fix a dripping pipe in apartment 6B. As I stepped out of the stairwell, I saw a section of the hallway that looked completely different. The paint was a soft pastel green, and the floor was covered in pinkish tiles that definitely weren't there before. I recognized the style. It looked like something from the 1970s. My stomach twisted. I peered into 6B. The door itself was different, a simple wooden door with a brass handle. I knocked on it. No answer. The hallway was silent except for the distant hum of old fluorescent lights. I knocked again, but nobody came. I decided to check the pipe later. I didn't feel safe there. I moved down to the 5th floor, trying to avoid the walls that had changed. I kept my eyes on the ground. I didn't want to hear more voices or trigger more transformations, but I couldn't help it. My curiosity got the best of me. I pressed my ear to the wall near apartment 5C again. I felt a sudden sense of dread. like stepping into a dark basement alone. But I couldn't stop. I heard new voices, a man and a woman this time, talking about the building's ownership. They were upset that Reynolds had sold off part of the property under the table. The woman said something about a crooked deal with city officials. I realized these secrets were piling up in my head. I felt a pain in my chest. My breathing turned shallow. My hands trembled as I stood up. The hallway changed again, right in front of my eyes. The fluorescent lights flickered out, and I saw old-fashioned pendant lamps hanging from the ceiling. The air smelled like cigar smoke and musty carpets. My chest tightened even more. I reached out to touch the wall, and the surface felt like that old wallpaper pattern again. I yanked my hand back. I rushed to the stairwell door, my feet slipping on the changing floor. The door felt heavier, like metal from an older era. I yanked it open, almost losing my balance. The stairwell was mostly normal, but some of the steps had turned into cracked cement. I took the stairs down to the lobby, 2 at a time, my heart pounding. When I got to the lobby, I saw the front desk was still modern with a computer and a phone. I took a deep breath. My throat was dry and I wanted water, but I was afraid to stay in the building any longer. I left early. I went to a nearby diner, ordered a black coffee, and tried to calm down. My fingers wouldn't stop shaking. I kept thinking about the voices and the changes. It was like each conversation I heard pushed the building deeper into its own past. I had no clue how to stop it. The next few days, I avoided the walls. I focused on my tasks, changing light bulbs, unclogging drains, sweeping stairwells, and emptying trash. But the changes followed me. Each time I walked into a new hallway, I saw old wallpaper, antique lighting, or even outdated room numbers. Some doors had switched back to older designs, while others stayed modern. No one else in the building seemed to notice. Tenants walked by, staring at their phones, not paying attention to the peeling wallpaper or the flickering old bulbs. It was like I was the only one seeing it. One afternoon, while I was checking the boiler in the basement, I noticed rust on some of the pipes that I'd replaced last year. Those pipes should have been brand new. Now they looked ancient. I listened carefully. A faint echo reached my ears. I could hear footsteps above me, but they sounded heavy, like boots on hardwood floors, not the usual footsteps on linoleum or carpet. I felt sweat trickle down my temple. My neck felt stiff. I realized the entire building was slipping back in time, piece by piece. I tried telling the building manager, Mr. Gray, that something strange was happening. He shrugged it off. He said, "It's an old building, you know. Weird stuff happens." He laughed. I asked if he'd noticed the wallpaper on the 5th floor. He hadn't. He said I was making a big deal out of normal wear and tear. I knew he wouldn't help, so I tried to keep my head down. But one evening, as I was collecting trash on the 4th floor, I heard a distinct crash of glass from the hallway behind me. I turned around and saw a broken light fixture on the floor, but it wasn't the modern fixture. It was an old brass lantern with shattered glass panels. I felt my chest tighten again, and I almost lost my balance. The overhead light that replaced it was flickering. I crouched and tried to clean up the broken glass, my hands shaking. Suddenly, I felt a presence behind the wall. It was like someone was breathing near my ear. I froze. I held my breath, then slowly put my ear against the wall. I heard that same group of voices from before, talking about bribery, forging documents, and threatening each other. They were louder now, like the walls were thinner. My heart pounded in my throat. My pulse raced. I couldn't ignore it. I couldn't focus on anything else. The tension made my muscles tense up, and my palms felt clammy. I wanted to run, but I stayed. I listened. They said the building had been used for secret financial deals and that certain floors were remodeled to hide evidence. The man with the calmer voice insisted they had to keep everything quiet or risk losing the entire property. The woman said they were all complicit. Then there was a long silence. I pulled back and noticed my breath was shaking. The hallway had dimmed again. The walls showed water stains. The air felt heavier. It smelled like dust and old cigarettes. The transformation was happening faster. I grabbed my cleaning cart and rushed to the elevator, hoping I could reach the lobby before something else changed. The elevator panel flickered. The numbers were old-fashioned. My reflection in the metal door looked pale and sweaty. I clenched my jaw and tried to stay calm. Every second felt like an hour. When I reached the lobby, the desk was still modern, but the floor was a checkerboard tile pattern that belonged in another era. My stomach churned. I stepped outside onto the sidewalk, leaning on a lamppost to steady myself. The outside world was normal. Cars passed by, people walked around carrying their groceries, laughing or talking on their phones. The building behind me, though, felt like it was stuck between different decades. That night, I decided I had to find a way to make it stop. I didn't have any big plan. I just wanted to stop hearing these voices. So I went to the basement. I grabbed a bucket of plaster, a few tools, and some paint. I headed to the 5th floor. I saw that the walls there had almost completely reverted to old wallpaper and chipped plaster. The wooden floor creaked under my feet. I knelt down and started scraping off the peeling wallpaper. My hands were shaking as I worked. Every scrape felt like I was digging into something forbidden. I plastered over the old section, covering it bit by bit. I felt the cold sweat on my forehead. My arms burned from the effort. When I finished, I repainted the wall with modern paint. I waited for it to dry, my legs sore from kneeling. I didn't hear any voices that night. The hallway stayed quiet. I touched the wall, testing it. It felt solid, normal. My stomach still felt like it was in knots and my breath was shaky, but I felt a small relief. Maybe I had sealed up that connection. I tried the same method on the 6th floor the next day. I patched up every suspicious patch of old wallpaper or plaster I could find. I sealed the cracks. I painted over them. I took longer than usual to finish my rounds, but I managed to cover most of the changes. Over the next week, I avoided pressing my ear to the walls. I focused on normal repairs. I even kept headphones in my ears sometimes, hoping that would stop me from catching any stray voices. The transformation slowed down. Less old wallpaper showed up. I didn't see as many antique fixtures. The floors stayed modern. I took that as a sign that covering up those spots was working. I still feel uneasy every time I pass the areas I patched. I keep expecting the old voices to burst through. Some nights I hear faint murmurs, but I try to ignore them. I haven't told anyone. Who would believe me? I just do my job, keep the walls looking fresh, and do my best to ignore whatever is trapped beneath the surface. I don't think it's gone forever, but for now the building seems stable. I still get chills whenever I'm on the 5th floor. Sometimes I feel like the walls are breathing behind the paint, but I'm not about to press my ear against them again. I'd rather not risk it. All I know is that I never asked for this. I'm just a guy who cleans up after everyone else, and I stumbled on something I can't explain. If I leave, nobody will be here to keep the past from swallowing the entire building. I guess this is my responsibility now. So I keep a bucket of plaster and a paint roller in my cart at all times. If the building starts reverting again, I'll do what I have to do. I'll seal it up and move on, because I can't let the past break through, and I can't let those voices change the present any more than they already have. That's the truth, plain and simple. And if anyone asks why I'm always repainting the walls, I'll just say it's routine maintenance. They don't need to know anything else. I remember the day I picked up that Victorian mirror at an estate sale. I spotted it against a wall, half covered by a dusty sheet. The frame looked elaborate, with ornate carvings of leaves and small floral patterns. I'm an antiques dealer, so I see old stuff all the time. But there was something about this mirror that drew me in. It felt heavier than I expected when I lifted it, and the glass itself had a faint, uneven quality. The woman running the sale told me it had been passed down through the family for generations. She didn't know much more than that, and she seemed eager to get rid of it. I paid a fair price and took it back to my shop. I run a small store in a quiet neighborhood. I get customers who are either serious collectors or casual browsers looking for odd pieces to decorate their homes. When I brought in the mirror, I propped it up against a wall in the back room. I planned to clean it, make a quick assessment of its age and condition, and then decide how much I might list it for. At that point, I just considered it one more item in my inventory. That evening, after closing up, I decided to polish the frame. It had a dark, slightly reddish tint to the wood. As I wiped away the dust, I felt a few spots where the carving seemed deeper, almost like shallow gouges. I shined my flashlight to see if there was any sign of wood rot, but it just looked old. There was a subtle chemical smell too, like old varnish or maybe some old polish. None of that felt unusual. I see odd smells or textures on antiques all the time. After a few minutes of cleaning, I straightened up and caught my reflection. My first thought was that I looked exhausted. The shop had been busy that week and I hadn't slept much. That's when I noticed something strange. My reflection seemed off by a fraction of a second. At first I assumed I was just tired or that the old glass was distorting the light. I moved my hand to my face and felt my forehead. A second later, I saw my reflection do the same thing. But it was too slow. My hand was already at rest against my face before the image in the mirror completed the movement. I stood there for a bit and tested small gestures, like a nod or a wave. Each time, there was a tiny delay. It was maybe half a second, if that. It was almost unnoticeable unless you stared. I tried to tell myself the mirror was just warped somehow, yet it kept nagging at me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I set down my cloth and walked out of the room. I had a mild headache by then, so I decided to lock up and head home. The next morning, I walked into the shop a bit earlier than usual. I felt a strange urge to check the mirror again. I turned on the lights in the back room and glanced at it. It looked normal at first glance, just an old mirror leaning against a brick wall. I approached it carefully, like I was expecting it to jump out at me. I stood in front of it and raised my hand. The reflection copied me in time, so I figured maybe I had imagined the delay the night before. I had to open the shop, so I left the mirror alone for most of the day. But it never left my mind. Later that afternoon, a regular customer came by. He asked if I had any new finds. I gave him a quick tour of the stuff I had acquired recently. I showed him a vintage lamp, some brass figurines, and I debated showing him the mirror, but I decided not to. Something about the mirror felt personal, like I wasn't ready to sell it yet. He eventually left with a small silver box. After that, I went back to the mirror. This time I felt more alert, and I wanted to run a simple test. I stood in front of it and lifted my right arm fast. The reflection followed, but I noticed maybe a 1-second delay now. It was definitely there. I put my arms down and moved them up again, more slowly. The reflection lagged again, just enough to catch my attention. I tried walking away from the mirror, and I watched it out of the corner of my eye. The reflection walked away too, but half a beat later. I began to sweat a bit. The room felt stuffy, even though the air conditioning was on. I felt my palms getting clammy, and I had this tightness in my chest, like I was waiting for something else to happen. I stepped closer to the mirror and leaned in, trying to see if there was something embedded in the glass that could cause a delay. I didn't see anything, just my own face staring back. It was a little unsettling to see my face not move exactly when I did. I blinked quickly a few times. The mirror blinked, but always a bit slower. Over the next few days, the delay got worse. It went from half a second to a full second, then to almost 2 seconds. One evening, I closed up the shop and stood in front of the mirror for what felt like half an hour, just experimenting. I waved my arms, I made faces, I jumped up and down. Each time my reflection repeated the action, but it was always behind me by a couple of seconds. My heart started pounding harder each time I noticed the delay growing. I felt small drops of sweat rolling down the sides of my face. My breaths became more shallow and quick. I had this steady, nagging fear in my gut, like I was on the edge of discovering something I wouldn't like. I wiped my forehead with a rag and stared at myself. I felt a sudden urge to speak to the reflection, so I opened my mouth. My reflection only opened its mouth after I finished saying, "Hello." Hearing myself say that word and then seeing the reflection respond late made me step back. I nearly tripped on a loose floorboard behind me. I decided to move the mirror into the storage room in the basement. It's a cramped space with concrete walls and a single overhead light. I wanted to hide it away until I could figure out what was going on. I lugged it down the stairs, feeling the weight in my arms, and propped it against a wall near some wooden crates. I covered it with a piece of fabric and walked away. My hands were shaking by the time I locked the basement door. That night I tried to sleep, but I kept replaying the image of my reflection lagging behind, like it was trying to catch up but couldn't. A couple of days later I realized I needed to sell something expensive to cover some upcoming bills. My mind went straight to the mirror. Victorian pieces can fetch a good price, especially if they're in decent shape. I decided I was going to take a few pictures and see if I could find a potential buyer who specialized in old mirrors. Even if it had this strange delay, maybe that was just a quirk in the glass that someone else might find intriguing. I went to the basement and pulled off the cover. The mirror looked dull. Dust had settled on it in just a couple of days. I wiped it off with a cloth. My own face stared back, and for the first few seconds it seemed normal. I lifted my hand to wave. The reflection didn't move at all. I froze, my heart pounding. Then, after about 3 seconds, it finally waved back. I let out a shaky breath. I took out my phone to snap a few photos. The reflection in the phone screen was odd. My reflection was in a slightly different posture than I was. It wasn't huge, but enough to notice. I raised my phone to shoulder height, but in the mirror, my reflection's phone seemed to be a bit lower, near chest level. I wanted to see if the photos captured that difference. I snapped a series of pictures, but when I looked at them on the phone, I only saw a still image of me taking a photo. It didn't show any delay, obviously. Photos wouldn't catch a timing difference. I decided I had to see if the reflection would ever do something I wasn't doing. Part of me wanted to end this whole thing, move the mirror out of the shop, and forget I ever bought it. Another part of me had this strange curiosity. Could a reflection really move on its own? I stared at it for what felt like an hour, though it was probably just 10 minutes. I stood there, not moving, just breathing. My reflection stood there too, but it blinked a moment or two after I did. I felt my heart rate spike when I realized it didn't blink every time I blinked. Sometimes it would remain staring when I had already blinked twice. My eyes started to burn from trying to keep them open or track my reflections blinking. I stepped back and leaned against a stack of crates. My legs felt shaky. Over the next few days, I found myself drawn to the basement more often. I would take short breaks from the front of the shop, wander downstairs, and look at the mirror. The delay grew each time. It reached a point where it was almost 5 seconds behind. I'd raise my arm, and I'd see my reflection stand still. Then, after a few seconds, it would lift its arm. When I dropped my arm, it stayed there, arm still raised for those same extra seconds before mirroring my move. One afternoon, I decided to test the reflection again, but in a more careful way. I brought a small stool and sat in front of the mirror. I set an old clock on a crate next to me so I could measure the delay. I would nod at exact times and watch the reflection. It always did the same action, but about 5 or 6 seconds later now. My breaths felt shallower and my mouth was dry. I kept swallowing hard because my throat felt tight. Then something happened that made my stomach twist into a knot. I scratched my cheek, a small, quick gesture. My reflection didn't move at all for a few seconds. I watched and waited, expecting it to catch up and scratch its cheek too. But it just stood there. A moment later, it scratched its opposite cheek. I felt a burst of heat rush to my face, like a sudden flush of adrenaline. My reflection was doing a similar gesture, but on the wrong side of its face. My mind started racing. My pulse throbbed in my ears, and I could feel my hands trembling. I stood up, nearly knocking over the stool. I paced around the basement, trying to calm down. I kept sneaking glances at the mirror, but for a few minutes it just stood there, matching my general posture if I stopped moving, but never at the same time. I decided I needed to get some fresh air, so I hurried up the stairs and slammed the basement door. I stood in the hallway, leaning against the wall, taking big gulps of air until my heartbeat slowed. I tried to tell myself it was some sort of optical illusion. Maybe the old glass was warping my perception of time or movement. but deep down I knew that didn't make sense. There's no ordinary flaw that would cause a reflection to act on its own or do a reversed gesture. I looked at the time on my phone. I still had a couple of hours before the shop closed. I felt drained, so I forced myself to focus on routine tasks. I greeted a couple of customers, handled a sale of a small desk lamp, and acted like nothing was wrong. That evening I went back down there with a flashlight. The overhead light in the basement is weak, and I wanted a better look at the mirror. I approached it slowly. My reflection was waiting, but it felt like it was looking at me before I even got in front of it. I moved the flashlight beam across the surface of the glass, checking for cracks. I didn't see any. The surface was smooth and intact. I decided to test it again, so I nodded and waited. I counted 8 seconds before the reflection nodded. The delay was getting longer every day. I tried waving. After about 10 seconds, it waved back. My stomach was churning, and I started feeling lightheaded. I was about to turn away when my reflection gave me a slow smile. I didn't smile. My mouth was shut tight, and I was breathing through my nose. I felt ice-cold sweat breaking out across my forehead. My legs felt locked, and for a moment I thought I might collapse. I turned off the flashlight and backed away, keeping my eyes on the mirror, even though I could hardly see it. I turned on my heels and practically jogged up the stairs. I locked the basement door and went straight to my small office in the shop. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely unlock my office door. I stepped inside, sat at my desk, and tried to steady my breathing. I didn't sleep well that night. My bed felt too soft, my pillow felt too hot, and my mind kept replaying the image of that crooked smile. The next day I arrived at the shop with a plan. I was going to get rid of the mirror. I didn't care if I made any money off it. I decided to drive it to the nearest auction house and let them deal with it. I didn't want to face it anymore. When I got to the shop, though, I felt like I owed it one last look to make sure it was still there and not doing something else. I forced myself downstairs. I kept the lights off at first, but then I flicked them on. The mirror was leaning against the wall. The reflection was there, but I saw it moving a second or two before I stepped into view. It straightened its posture as if it had been slouching. I felt my throat tighten, and I clenched my fists. I walked closer and stopped about 3 feet away. My reflection stood still. I lifted my arm halfway, not a full gesture, just a slight lift. 10 seconds passed, and it lifted its arm all the way above its head. I stumbled back, almost losing my balance. My breath got stuck in my chest. I was done. I went to grab a tarp from a shelf. I planned to throw it over the mirror and carry it out to my van. As soon as I turned around, I saw that my reflection was doing something different again. It leaned forward, pressed its hand to the glass, and stared out with this intent look. My heart hammered in my chest so hard I felt it in my temples. I rushed forward, tossed the tarp over the mirror, and avoided looking at it. I heard a faint tapping sound from underneath the tarp, like a fingernail tapping the glass. I yanked the mirror up, practically hugging it against my body, and shuffled my way to the stairs. I kept hearing that tapping. My arms ached from the weight and my mouth was dry. Each step upstairs felt heavier than usual. I moved through the back room and out the side door to my van. I slid the mirror inside and slammed the doors shut. I took a minute to catch my breath. My hands were shaking and I felt sweat soaking through the back of my shirt. I got in the driver's seat and started the van. I pulled away from the shop, trying not to think about the mirror in the back. I could still hear that faint tap in my mind, even though I knew it might just be my imagination. I drove toward the auction house with both hands gripping the wheel, knuckles white. I wanted that mirror out of my life. No one died and there were no kids involved, but I still felt like I was in danger. I can't explain how a mirror can do something like that, and I'm not going to try. I just wanted to get rid of it and never see it again. That's all I can say. Even now, when I think about that reflection moving on its own, my pulse starts racing. I never put that mirror up for sale in my shop. Instead, I left it at the auction house with minimal paperwork. I never followed up to see if anyone bought it or if it ended up in some storage facility. Sometimes, when I'm alone in my shop late at night, I'll notice my reflection in a regular mirror, and for a split second, I think I see it lag. My stomach clenches. and I have to look away. I might never get over that feeling, but I'm just grateful it's gone from here. I never thought I would hear old music sneaking into my recordings. That first day, I sat in the main booth at the Crown Bell Theater, adjusting the audio levels for a rehearsal. I noticed a strange hum under the mics, so I isolated the signal. I expected room noise, maybe static from a mic cable. Instead, I got a faint tune that sounded old. It was gentle but clear, and I knew it wasn't part of the rehearsal. It made me freeze for a second. The theater felt colder than usual. I looked through the glass window and saw the actors on stage warming up their voices. None of them were singing that melody. I remember checking each channel one by one to see if there was some hidden feed or a stray radio frequency. Nothing made sense. That was the moment I realized something very odd was happening. My name is Anthony. I'm 34. I've worked as a sound engineer for about 10 years. I've handled everything from rock concerts in small clubs to big events at outdoor arenas. But this historic theater job was special. The Crown Bell Theater was built in the 1930s. I accepted the job because I liked the vibe of old places. I liked the solid wood floors, the thick velvet curtains, the heavy backstage doors. I liked the sense of history in every corner. But I never guessed that history would push its way into my recordings. That day, I kept quiet about what I heard. I didn't want to scare the stage crew or the cast. I just saved a separate audio file, labeled it unknown noise, and tried to move on. My shift ended late. I packed up my gear around 11 at night. The cast had left an hour earlier, and the crew was finishing up the lighting checks. I walked through the empty hallway that led to the exit. I felt a slight draft. The building always felt drafty at night. I heard a squeak from the old floorboards. My heart beat a little faster than normal. I shrugged it off and left. When I got home, I replayed the clip. The melody sounded like it came from another room or from behind a wall. It was definitely an older style. The audio was scratchy, but it had a certain warmth to it. I wondered if it could be a radio station drifting in through cheap equipment, but my gear was professional grade, and the theater's location didn't usually get random signals. I also checked the building schematics. The walls were thick and the electromagnetic interference was minimal. I tried to stay calm. Maybe there was a logical explanation, like a forgotten speaker hidden somewhere. Yet something felt weird. I couldn't let it go. The next morning, I arrived early. I went straight to the stage area to inspect every speaker and cable. The stage had classic floor wedges, plus overhead clusters. I traced each cable run, opened the patch panels, and confirmed that everything matched the current setup. There was no sign of an old feed or hidden line. I moved on to the dressing rooms. The floors creaked, and the light fixtures flickered. My chest felt tight. I tried to slow my breathing. I told myself I was just tired. I checked the control room next. The old analog board from decades ago sat in a dusty corner. The current digital console was set up in front of it. I tested each mic input with my headphones on, one after the other. No static, no odd hum. Rehearsals started at noon, so I positioned myself behind the new console. The actors were going through a scene. I recorded the ambient sound for reference. My spine tingled when I heard that same faint tune again in my headphones. This time it sounded like a big band orchestra piece. It had a steady drum pattern and horns. I swallowed hard. I pulled down all the live mics, but the tune still leaked in. It was quiet, like something playing far away. My hands started to shake. I saw the stage manager frown at me through the booth window, probably wondering why my face looked so tense. I pretended everything was fine. During a break, I listened to what I had recorded. The music faded in and out, about 5 minutes total. It reminded me of those old radio broadcasts from the 1940s. The horns were crisp. The vocals, if there were any, were too soft to make out, but the style was clear. I decided to talk to Gary, the production manager. I waited until the actors left for lunch. Then I cornered him by the backstage staircase. I kept my voice low. I told him about the strange music. He looked at me with confusion. He asked me if I had messed up the channel routing. I said no. I explained the thorough checks I did. He shrugged. He said the theater was old and weird stuff happened. Then he walked away like he had better things to do. I spent the afternoon avoiding conversation. I listened closely during each scene. The old music slipped in a few times, never loud, never consistent, but it was there. It blended with the present-day lines, creating a weird overlap. I recorded everything. By the time rehearsal ended, my nerves were on edge. My shoulders felt stiff. My mouth was dry. I shut down the gear and saved the files. I told myself I would figure this out after hours. That night I stayed behind after everyone left. I set up a few ambient mics around the auditorium. I ran cables to the booth, locked the doors, and sat alone. The air felt thick, like there wasn't enough circulation. I sipped water and waited. Around 10, I heard a faint piano scale. I checked my monitors. The sound definitely came from the channels I set up. I got out of my seat and walked down the aisle. My shoes clacked on the wood floor. On stage, it was quiet. I felt a chill on my arms. I walked behind the curtains. Nothing. The backstage corridor was empty. I returned to the booth. On playback, I heard about 30 seconds of a piano tune. It sounded old-fashioned with a slower tempo. I felt my stomach tighten. I rubbed my eyes. This wasn't feedback or interference. It felt like I was picking up actual performances from a different time. I started thinking about old shows the theater hosted. I recalled reading a plaque near the lobby that mentioned famous big band performances in the 1940s and 1950s. My mind raced. I tried to focus on concrete tasks. I labeled the clips, checked the waveforms, and looked at the frequency analysis. The signals fell within normal audio ranges, but they had a distinct timbre that matched older recording equipment. It confused me. I felt sweat collecting on my forehead. I decided to keep going, so I pressed record again and left it running. About an hour later, I heard a brief burst of applause in my headphones. I almost jumped out of my chair. I didn't see or hear anything in the theater itself. The place was dark. I only had a few dim lights on. I felt like someone was watching me, but I saw nobody. I walked around the seats, shining my phone's flashlight. Rows of old wooden chairs. Silent. No sign of anyone. My heart thumped. My breath felt shallow. I tried to calm down by focusing on the basics. I was alone, I was safe, and I had a job to do. I returned to the booth and listened again. The recording had crowd noise, clapping, and a faint cheer, like an excited audience from many years ago. My hands felt clammy. My eyes watered. I didn't know what else to do, so I stopped the recording and packed up. I didn't want to spend the night there. I went home and listened to all the files I had gathered. There was a pattern. Each clip had a different style of music. Some had big band elements. Some had classical piano. One had a snippet of what sounded like an old show tune. The applause and crowd noises matched older performance styles. There were no modern elements. This was definitely not the current cast. I felt uneasy. I decided I would share the files with a friend of mine, Daniel, who also worked in audio. I wanted a second opinion. We arranged to meet in a coffee shop near the theater. The next day, we sat in a booth with our laptops. I handed him my headphones, and I played a few of the tracks. He looked at me with wide eyes. He said he had never heard anything like it. The recordings weren't typical radio interference. He recognized the audio signature of older equipment, like vintage ribbon microphones or older analog mixers. But there was no good explanation for how that signal appeared in my modern gear. He asked me if the Crown Bell Theater had any broadcasting system that might still be active. I told him no, not as far as I knew. He shook his head. He looked nervous. I asked him what I should do. He shrugged and said he'd probably collect more evidence, maybe interview older staff. After lunch, I returned to the theater. I approached an older custodian named Frank, who had been working there for a long time. I asked him if he ever heard strange music after hours. He paused. He looked at me for a moment. Then he said he'd heard weird sounds in the hallway sometimes, usually after midnight. He said it didn't bother him, so he never reported it. I felt my stomach clench again. I asked him if he knew about old shows that might be connected. He said the theater used to hold variety nights in the 1950s, with dance bands and singers. He said many of them were popular back in the day. I thanked him for his time and went back to my booth. That evening I had to work late again. The production was wrapping up and they wanted final tweaks for the next day's rehearsal. I stayed alone in the control room checking levels. Around 9 p.m., I heard footsteps in the corridor behind me. I turned around, but no one was there. My pulse sped up. I stood up and looked around. The hallway was empty. I stepped outside the control room, walked a few steps, and listened. The floor squeaked. The air smelled musty. My ears rang. I called out, "Hello?" No answer. I felt the hair on my arm stand up. I went back inside and closed the door. I told myself the building was old and everything creaked. I decided to record one more ambient track that night. I set up a single condenser mic in the center of the auditorium. I rolled a long cable back to the control room. The place was silent, except for the occasional hum of the HVAC. I dimmed the lights and watched the waveform on my screen. For about 15 minutes, there was nothing. Then I noticed a small spike. The line rose a little bit. My heart beat faster. I turned up the monitor volume. I heard a slow saxophone melody, about 10 seconds long. Then it faded. My hands started to sweat. I kept the recording going. A few minutes later, I heard faint laughter like a small group of people enjoying the show. It lasted maybe 5 seconds. My chest felt tight. My legs shook under the console. Then the channel went quiet again. I saved that file and played it back immediately. It was clear. Saxophone. Laughter. No distortion. I couldn't explain it. I stared at the empty stage through the booth window. Dark seats. Empty aisles. But my monitors had just picked up a short performance. I felt a wave of dread. I packed up my stuff, folded the cable, and turned off the lights. I closed up the booth. When I stepped into the auditorium to collect the mic, I felt cold air. I scanned the rows of seats with my phone flashlight. Everything was still. I grabbed the mic stand, my heart pounding, and hurried out. That night, I barely slept. The next morning, I tried to keep it together at work. I felt jumpy. The cast asked if I was okay. I lied and said I was just stressed about the show schedule. I went about my tasks, adjusting levels for the dress rehearsal. During the run-through, I captured more bits of old music. One section overlapped with a present-day dance routine. It created a weird dissonance in my headphones. I felt lightheaded, but I kept recording. After the show ended, I stayed in the booth to listen back. The old music was right there again. It sounded sharper, like it was mixing with the live performance in real time. The cast had no idea. I realized I couldn't handle this alone anymore. The next day I told Gary I was picking up strange signals again. This time I played the files for him. He listened with a blank expression. Then he said we should ignore it and focus on the show. He didn't want any distractions. I got angry, but I kept my voice level. I asked if we could bring in a specialist or at least check the old wiring in the walls. He brushed me off. He said the budget was tight. He said old buildings have quirks. I walked out of his office feeling frustrated and sweaty. That night, I stayed late one last time. I set up multiple microphones around the theater. One in the lobby, one in the balcony, one on the stage, and one backstage. I wanted to see if the signals showed up everywhere. I spent an hour roaming between each mic location. The building felt heavy, like the walls were pressing in on me. My throat felt dry and my shirt clung to my back. As I walked backstage, I caught a brief sound in real time. A trumpet blast that echoed down the hallway. I stood still, holding my breath. The sound vanished. My heart hammered in my chest. I scrambled back to the booth. On playback, I heard that trumpet blast. It was exactly as I experienced it, loud and clear for a moment. Then silence. I felt my legs shake. I decided I needed to leave right away. I gathered my gear, locked up, and stepped outside into the night air. My hands trembled when I put my keys in my car. I drove home, sweating the whole way. The next day, I called in sick. I told Gary I had a fever. Then I forwarded all the files to Daniel and asked him to analyze them more thoroughly. I told him I couldn't keep doing this. I didn't know what else to do. Maybe the building had some strange acoustic phenomenon that trapped old echoes. Maybe there was old recording equipment embedded in the walls. I had no clue. I only knew that I kept capturing music from decades ago, and it was blending with the sounds of the present. It felt impossible, but my recordings didn't lie. I still work at the theater, but I avoid staying late now. I handle my tasks during normal hours and leave as soon as possible. Sometimes when I'm alone at the console, I hear a soft trace of an old tune in my headphones. My heart skips a beat. I lower the volume and try to ignore it. I've accepted that the theater holds pieces of its past that slip through. I can't explain how or why, but I've documented enough to know it's real. I've stopped sharing it with most people. It's just part of my job now. I manage the present-day shows and hope those old sounds stay quiet. If they don't, I just record them and move on. I'm done trying to figure it out. I'm just trying to do my job and keep my nerves in check. That's all I can do. I never imagined I would spend my nights pacing through a dark museum, fighting off chills that crept up my spine every time I heard the scrape of metal or the clack of porcelain in a distant gallery. My name is Roger Price, and I've been the curator of this small local museum for 2 years. I took this job because I love history, and I wanted to share that love with the public. But now, I'm on edge every evening. It began a few weeks ago, when I noticed subtle changes in the displays. At first I thought the cleaning crew was moving the items by mistake, but they swore they hadn't touched anything. I tried to ignore it, but the differences got bigger. Swords from the medieval exhibit weren't in their normal spots. A vase from the Roman corner was found near the Egyptian sarcophagi. The mistakes felt strange, yet I brushed them off as carelessness. But then I caught sight of a figurine in the wrong case right before closing. This piece usually sat next to a set of colonial plates far from the front entrance. I remember checking that area earlier in the day. The figurine had been there at noon, and now it was not. It shouldn't have been near the entrance at all. Nobody had reported any problem, so I went to my office, pulled the security tapes, and reviewed them. At first, I didn't see anything. The hours sped by, frames flickered, and nothing happened. But then, for a few seconds, the screen glitched. When the footage came back, the figurine was gone from its original spot. There was no sign of a break-in or any staff meddling. That was the moment I realized something was off. I decided to stay after hours. I wanted to see if someone was sneaking around. So I told the night guard I'd be working late, and I hid in the library behind some old shelves. Around 2 a.m., I heard scraping. It sounded like wood dragging across the floor. I peered out into the corridor. The overhead lights were on a timer, so only every other light was lit. The darkness was thick in the corners. I crept forward, stopping every few steps to listen. The scraping got louder. Then I reached the entrance to the medieval gallery and felt a cold sweat forming on my forehead. A knight's armor, which had been positioned upright on a wooden stand, was slumped against a wall. The shield that was usually resting on its left arm was lying on the floor. At the same time, a small wooden chest from the pirate exhibit stood in the middle of the walkway, even though it belonged 3 rooms away. I leaned in to examine the armor. I wanted to check for footprints or marks that might reveal if someone had dragged it, but I didn't see anything obvious. My heart thumped in my ears. I heard another noise, this time from the room featuring Renaissance paintings. I hurried there, trying not to stumble. When I reached the doorway, I found a scattered pile of documents on the floor. These weren't from our collection. They looked very old and had seals and faded handwriting. The language was some form of archaic Spanish or Portuguese. I couldn't be certain. The paper was brittle. The edges crumbled when I picked them up. I felt a stab of confusion. How did these documents get here? I switched on the overhead light in the room. The brightness made me squint. I carefully placed the documents on a table. I wanted to see if they'd mention anything about the items in the museum. I read a few lines, but I couldn't make much sense of it. It referenced voyages, goods transported overseas, and references to a scuffle between factions I had never heard of. I noticed a stamp with a coat of arms that didn't match any local family or known emblem. My mind raced. I wondered if these documents had something to do with the colonial plates in the next room. We had an entire exhibit about early trade routes, but I'd never seen these specific records. Still, I had no proof they were connected to any artifact in the museum. I decided to take some photos with my phone. My hands shook as I snapped a few pictures trying to capture the text. My breathing got heavier. My chest felt tight. I sensed I wasn't alone. I looked over my shoulder but saw no one. The entire museum was silent. Even the HVAC system seemed oddly quiet. I blinked a few times trying to refocus and realized how tense my muscles were. My back ached from the rigid posture I was holding. I rubbed my neck and forced myself to keep calm. I gathered the old documents, placed them in an archival box I had grabbed from the library, and walked back to my office. I wanted to see if the security cameras had recorded anything else. Once I got there, I locked the door. The monitor showed different angles, but none were near the room with the Renaissance paintings. The system is old. We only have cameras in key spots, not covering every corner. I fast-forwarded, pausing whenever I noticed movement, but I didn't see a single person. The chest and the armor had moved sometime around 1:45 a.m., but the camera froze for a few seconds during that exact time. When it resumed, the items were in their new positions. The next morning, I approached my boss, the head of the museum's board. I told him we had some strange activity and found suspicious documents. He looked at me with confusion. He asked if I was pranking him or if I was exhausted from working long hours. I insisted something bizarre was happening and I wanted permission to install more cameras. He shrugged and told me I could, but I'd have to handle the budget requests myself. He didn't give me much support. Still, I started making calls to different security companies. I also reached out to a local historian I knew, hoping they might help me decipher the documents I had found. That afternoon, I went to the pirate exhibit to check on the wooden chest. It was back in its usual place, locked and sealed, as if nothing had happened. There were no scratches on the floor, no sign it had been moved. I tried to lift it to see how heavy it was, and it weighed a lot. There's no way I'd miss the trail if it was dragged without a dolly. I got goosebumps just thinking about it moving on its own. It wasn't logical. Over the next few nights, I tried to catch the artifacts in the act. I switched up my hiding spots. I took cat naps in my office so I could have energy to stay awake. I'd roam the halls at different times. I saw more unsettling shifts. One night, I found the stuffed grizzly bear from our wildlife display stationed next to a medieval throne, as though it was standing guard. Another time, I saw the Roman vase lying on a bench outside the cafeteria area, with no cracks or damage. There was a bronze coin from the ancient Greece collection leaning against the foot of a 19th century soldier's uniform. It looked as if these items were staging miniature historical scenes, but they were mixing periods. Every time it happened, I'd find more old documents. They'd appear on pedestals, under chairs, or even tucked behind a painting. I always checked the security footage, and every time there was a few seconds of lost feed. I started getting jumpy during the day. People noticed. My assistant asked if I was okay. I said I was just tired. The truth was that I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd see at night. The tension built in my stomach. I felt my heartbeat speed up whenever I thought about the strange movements. I told myself it could be a hacker messing with the cameras. But that wouldn't explain how heavy objects were shifting around without leaving marks, or how these new documents kept appearing. After a week of this, the local historian showed up. Her name was Dr. Gomez. She wore thick glasses and carried a laptop bag. I led her to my office, locked the door, and showed her the documents. She examined them carefully, holding them up to the light, frowning at the stains and the old handwriting. She told me they appeared to be ship manifests and personal letters from the 16th century. They made reference to a group of explorers who traveled between Europe and the Americas. She pointed to a name that matched a small emblem we had on one of our oldest coins in the vault. She said the documents didn't just talk about normal trade. They mentioned secret shipments, possibly stolen artifacts. Then she pointed out a line about an amalgamation of relics meant to be hidden in safe havens for future generations to find. The text was vague, but it hinted that different objects had been transported together, forming an unexpected collection. I felt my chest tighten. I remembered the items that had been moving, pieces from different continents and eras. They could be part of this hidden group of relics. Maybe they belonged together in ways no one knew. Dr. Gomez asked if she could show these papers to a colleague, but I said I'd rather keep them here for now. I wanted to collect more evidence. She respected that. Then she left, promising to come back with more tools to analyze the documents. That night, I locked all the main doors myself. I double-checked every window. I even placed small pieces of tape at certain door frames, hoping I'd see if someone tried to enter. Then I took my usual position, this time in the main hallway, hidden behind a large statue. The hours crept by. My legs got stiff. Around midnight, I heard a faint clang. I held my breath and peered around the statue. The corridor was dim. I crawled forward, keeping close to the wall. I reached a corner and pressed myself flat. The clang echoed again. It was coming from the medieval gallery. I crawled on my hands and knees, my heart pounding so hard I felt it in my throat. When I got to the gallery, I peeked in. The knight's armor was off its stand again. It looked like it had fallen. The chest from the pirate exhibit was there, open, with a few old coins inside. I recognized them as part of the Greek exhibit. The thick smell of dust hung in the air. Then I noticed an open scroll resting against the base of a tall Egyptian statue. It wasn't ours. I moved quietly toward it. My palms were sweaty, and I felt a tremor in my hands. I saw the strange writing, a mix of hieroglyphs and some old cursive script. It seemed to describe a timeline of events, referencing ancient rituals and expansions of power. My eyes darted between the scroll and the armor. I felt like I was stumbling onto a hidden thread that linked all these artifacts together across centuries. I couldn't stop a shiver from coursing through me. The museum was silent, except for my own breathing. I backed up, still crouched, and ducked into a corner. I wanted to see if anything else would move. I tried to slow my breathing, but I kept taking short, tense breaths. Every time a pipe clanked or the air system kicked in, I jumped. Eventually, I saw no more movement. When I worked up the courage to walk back into the gallery, everything was as I'd left it, except the scroll was now closed. I was sure I'd left it open. I felt my stomach flip. I snatched the scroll, tucked it under my arm, and hurried to my office. I spent the rest of the night on edge, checking the security footage every few minutes. No new interruptions. But the same glitch appeared at around the same time as before. The only difference was that I had witnessed some of the movement myself. In the morning, I called Dr. Gomez again. I told her I had found another document. She arrived an hour later with a camera and some scanning equipment. I led her to a small lab we have in the back, where we sometimes examine old pieces. She set up her gear and did a quick test on the scroll. She said the material was authentic papyrus and it had writing styles from multiple periods. Some lines were definitely from the ancient period, while others looked like 14th or 15th century editions. It was as if people had added notes through time. She looked at me with wide eyes. I could see she was at a loss for an explanation. In the following days, more items moved at night. The staff started complaining about missing or displaced objects. A caretaker found old swords arranged in a pattern on the floor. A couple of staff members reported hearing footsteps when no one else was around. Everyone was spooked. I had the new cameras installed in several rooms, but every time the objects shifted, the footage was corrupted. I felt like I was in a cycle of confusion and dread, not knowing how to stop it. Then we started cross-referencing the new documents with our entire collection. Dr. Gomez and I discovered references to every major piece that had moved. Each item was mentioned in these texts as part of a special group of artifacts. The documents suggested that these relics were connected by a shared history of power struggles, alliances and betrayals across multiple continents. It seemed that whenever these relics came together, they recreated certain events tied to their past. We had no idea what those events were or what exactly triggered the movement, but it seemed unstoppable. The documents implied that the objects carried the memories of those old conflicts. Dr. Gomez said it felt like we were dealing with a puzzle that no one had solved before. I tried to keep my composure, but I was having nightmares. I'd wake up sweating, thinking I'd seen suits of armor marching through the halls or vases floating across the floor. I was exhausted. My head pounded. My entire body felt heavy during the day, and my nights were spent in a state of constant alert. I reached a point where I had to tell the museum board members everything. They looked at me like I was losing my mind. But Dr. Gomez backed me up. She had scientific analysis showing the documents were genuine. She also confirmed that the movement of the artifacts had no normal explanation. The board suggested we close the museum for a while, call in more experts, and keep the press away from the story. They didn't want to damage our reputation, but they also wanted answers. Now I'm waiting for a specialist team to come in. They've dealt with unexplained historical finds before. I'm not sure if they'll have a logical explanation or if they'll just confirm what I've seen. Every night I'm still on edge. The tension in my chest tightens whenever I pass a display, wondering if I'll find something out of place. My eyes dart around, searching for new documents. I've gathered them all in one locked room now, but they keep appearing in different spots. It feels like a never-ending cycle. I'm not sure what will happen next, but I feel like I'm in the middle of a real-life puzzle that I can't walk away from. The museum doesn't feel like a calm place anymore. Each artifact seems to have a secret, and they're all stepping out of their glass cases when no one's looking. I can't deny it. I've seen them move. I've touched these ancient papers that shouldn't exist in our collection. And every time I think I've seen it all, something else happens. I'm just bracing myself, keeping my eyes open and waiting for the night to come again. Because once it does, I know the museum will stir, and the old stories will move forward on their own.